Hello my friends and welcome back to Ranger Screams. Before we begin, this channel is going through a difficult time and your support means everything. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments on this video. If everyone watching right now takes just a second to leave a like and leave a comment, we can make it happen. And now, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. I was in Cave City, Kentucky, just outside Mammoth Cave National Park, late in June 2023. The plan was to take a short vacation, see the caves, maybe rent a canoe and float a portion of the Green River. Nothing fancy. I've always been drawn to the eerie hush of underground caverns, the cool air drifting through rock corridors. Something about being beneath the earth, surrounded by stone formed over millennia, gives me a sense of perspective. Or at least, it used to. The drive into Cave City was unremarkable. The town itself is small, catering primarily to tourists visiting the national park. I checked into a modest motel on the outskirts, a single-story building with rooms facing the parking lot. The woman at the front desk, middle-aged with graying hair pulled back into a tight bun, handed me a key attached to a plastic fob. Her fingers were gnarled, joints swollen with arthritis. When she smiled, I noticed a gap where her left canine should have been. "First time in Cave City?" she asked, her accent thick with Kentucky drawl. "Yes," I replied. "Looking forward to seeing the caves." She nodded, her smile fading slightly. "Stick to the marked paths. Mammoth is big, easy to get turned around." I didn't think much of her warning at the time. Standard advice for tourists, I assumed. That first evening, I ate at a diner in town. The place smelled of grease and coffee, and the vinyl booths were worn thin from decades of use. A group of locals sat in a corner booth, their voices dropping to whispers when I walked in. I caught fragments of their conversation as I ate my burger, something about another one gone missing and they're getting bolder. At the time, I dismissed it as small-town gossip. The next morning, I arrived at the visitor center, early. Mammoth Cave National Park is impressive even from the outside. Rolling hills covered in dense forest, the air heavy with humidity. Inside the center, I joined a tour group scheduled for the historic entrance route. There were families with excited children, elderly couples with sensible walking shoes, and a few solo travelers like myself. Our guide, a park ranger named Bill, had a booming voice and an encyclopedic knowledge of the cave system. "Mammoth Cave is the longest known cave system in the world," he explained as we descended the stone steps into the cave entrance. "Over 400 miles mapped, and who knows how much more waiting to be discovered." The temperature dropped noticeably as we entered the cave mouth. The historic entrance is massive, a yawning gateway into the earth. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness beyond the illuminated pathway, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The air carried the mineral scent of limestone and wet earth. Bill led us through the initial chambers, pointing out formations and recounting historical facts about the cave's exploration. I hung back slightly from the group, wanting to absorb the atmosphere without the chatter of the other tourists. In one of the larger chambers, known as the rotunda, the ceiling soared 50 feet above us, disappearing into shadows that the artificial lighting couldn't penetrate. "Feel that?" Bill asked, indicating the gentle current of air flowing through the passage. "The cave breathes. Air temperature outside versus inside creates a natural circulation. But there was something else in that air. Something beneath the expected mineral dampness, a subtle odor that seemed to cling to the back of my throat, like old meat left too long in the sun. None of the others appeared to notice it. I glanced at Bill, wondering if this was normal, but he was already moving the group forward, his voice echoing off the stone walls. As we ventured deeper, the developed pathways gave way to more rugged terrain. Metal handrails guided us along drops that fell away into darkness. The lighting became more strategic, illuminating the path and notable formations but leaving vast sections of the cave in impenetrable blackness. Several times, I was certain I heard something moving in those unlit spaces, a shuffling sound, like bare feet on stone, or a whispered exchange in a language I couldn't identify. At one point, while the group was admiring a particularly impressive stalactite formation, I noticed a narrow fissure in the wall, unlit and unmarked. It was hardly noticeable unless you were looking for it, just a shadow deeper than the others. As I stared, I could have sworn I saw movement within, a shifting of the darkness that couldn't be explained by the play of distant lights. A cold draft emerged from the opening, carrying that same faint, rancid smell I'd noticed earlier. "Sir, we're moving on." Bill's voice startled me. He stood a few feet away, the rest of the group already disappearing around a bend. His expression was polite, but his eyes were hard, darting to the fissure and back to me. "Sorry," I mumbled, moving away from the wall. "Thought I saw something." "Just shadows," he replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Best to stay with the group. Easy to get disoriented down here." For the remainder of the tour, I felt his gaze on me whenever I lingered too long or showed too much interest in the unmarked passages we occasionally passed. When we finally emerged back into the oppressive summer heat, I was relieved but also strangely disappointed. There was something about the cave that had gotten under my skin, a mystery I couldn't articulate. The rest of the day I hiked some of the surface trails in the park. The forest was lush, vibrant with summer growth. Birds called from the canopy, and insects buzzed in the undergrowth. But I couldn't shake the memory of that cold draft from the unmarked fissure, or the way Bill had watched me with such careful attention. As evening approached, I found myself on a lesser-used trail near the visitor center. The path was well-maintained but empty of other hikers as the day wound down. That's when I noticed it, a small, unmarked dirt path branching away from the main route. It looked more like a wildlife track than anything maintained by the Park Service. No signs warned against following it, but its very inconspicuousness made it intriguing. Curiosity got the better of me. I checked my phone, still a couple hours of daylight left, and started down the narrow track. The forest closed in around me, denser than along the main trails. The canopy thickened overhead, filtering the late afternoon sunlight into a green-tinged dimness. I walked for maybe 15 minutes, the path winding deeper into the woods, occasionally snapping pictures of interesting fungi or the patterns of light through the leaves. It was muggy, and the cicadas were droning loudly, their rhythmic pulsing filling the air with a sound that seemed to vibrate through my skull. Sweat beaded on my forehead and trickled down my back. I was about to turn around when everything changed. The woods fell quiet, not gradually, not with the natural ebb and flow of forest sounds. One moment, the air was filled with the cacophony of insects and birds. The next, silence fell like a physical weight. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, plunging the forest into an acoustic vacuum. I stopped, suddenly aware of my own breathing, too loud in the unnatural quiet. The hair on the back of my neck rose, and a chill ran down my spine despite the summer heat. Something was wrong. Every instinct screamed it. Yet I found myself moving forward, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. That's when I saw it in the distance, a dark opening in the hillside, partially concealed by undergrowth. Another cave entrance, but not one you'd find on any official map. This was no tourist attraction with paved walkways and strategic lighting. This was raw, primal, a wound in the earth. I approached cautiously, aware that I was far from the marked trails. As I drew closer, I began to hear something, a distant echo of voices, low and steady, emanating from deep within the darkness. It could have been chanting, or maybe just muffled conversation, but it had a rhythm to it that made my skin prickle, a cadence that seemed both familiar and profoundly alien. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just a group of spelunkers, locals who knew the hidden entrances, exploring chambers tourists never saw. Perhaps it was nothing more than the acoustics of the cave playing tricks, transforming the sound of dripping water into something that only resembled human voices. Then the smell hit me, a wall of putrid air that rolled out of the cave entrance like a physical entity. It was decay, but not the simple decomposition of dead leaves or fallen trees. This was meat left to rot, bodily fluids congealing in the dark. The unmistakable stench of death multiplied and concentrated. It hit me so hard I staggered backward, gagging, my eyes watering. In that moment of physical revulsion, clarity broke through my morbid fascination. Whatever was in that cave, I wanted no part of it. I turned to leave, to retrace my steps to the safety of the main trail, when I heard it. The snap of twigs behind me, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. Someone was there, watching. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting a park ranger come to warn me away from unmarked territory. Instead, I caught a glimpse of a tall figure in dark clothing, standing motionless between the trees about 30 yards back. The fading light made details difficult to discern, but the figure seemed unnaturally tall and thin, its proportions subtly wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It wore what looked like a long dark robe or coat that reached to the ground, obscuring its form. Where its face should have been was only shadow. As soon as I spotted it, the figure retreated, sliding behind a thick oak, with a fluid grace that seemed impossibly quick. I didn't wait to see if it would reappear. I broke into a jog, then a run, retracing the dirt path as quickly as I could without falling. The woods remained eerily silent as I fled, my own panicked breathing and pounding footsteps the only sounds in the vacuum. By the time I reached the main trail, I was practically sprinting, my shirt soaked with sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I slowed to catch my breath, looking back the way I'd come. The small path was barely visible from here, just a slight break in the undergrowth. No sign of pursuit, no tall, robed figure emerging from the trees, just the normal sounds of the forest returning gradually, like a radio being slowly turned up. I made it back to my car as dusk was settling over the park. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. Something about that unmarked cave entrance and the figure in the woods had shaken me deeply. It wasn't just fear of a stranger in an isolated place. It was something more primal, a recognition of wrongness that bypassed rational thought. As I drove back to the motel, I tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. The voices, the smell, the watching figure, none of it fit with the sanitized, carefully managed environment of a national park. Yet it had been real. The memory of that putrid stench still clung to my nostrils, and the image of that tall, unnaturally proportioned silhouette was burned into my mind. Back in my motel room, I showered, trying to wash away both the physical grime and the lingering unease. As I dressed, I decided to ask the motel clerk about what I'd found. Perhaps there was a simple explanation, an unmarked maintenance area, or a section of the cave system that had been closed to the public for safety reasons. I headed to the front desk, where the same woman from check-in was watching a small television mounted on the wall. A local news program was running a story about a missing hiker, the third disappearance in the area this year. The reporter stood in front of Mammoth Cave National Park's entrance sign, looking appropriately concerned as she delivered her report. The clerk muted the TV as I approached. "Everything all right with your room?" she asked. "The room's fine," I said, then hesitated, unsure how to phrase my question without sounding like a paranoid tourist. I was hiking today, and I think I might have stumbled on an unofficial part of the cave system, a small entrance, off the marked trails. Her expression changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight pulling back of her shoulders. Where exactly was this? I described the location as best I could. With each detail, her face grew more closed, more guarded. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Sounds like you were near the Forbidden Holes," she finally said. Her voice lowered even though we were alone in the lobby. "The Forbidden Holes? It's what locals call some of the sealed-off cave entrances in the park's outskirts." She glanced toward the door, as if checking to make sure no one was about to walk in. "They're not on any official maps. Park Service doesn't acknowledge them." "Why are they sealed off?" I asked. She hesitated, her gnarled fingers picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Safety, they say. Unstable formations, flooding risks. That's the official line. And unofficially?" Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's talk in town, has been for generations, about a group that uses those caverns for gatherings." "What kind of gatherings?" I pressed. "The kind decent folks don't discuss," she replied sharply, then seemed to regret her tone. She sighed, shoulders slumping. "Look, I'm not one for gossip, but people have gone missing over the years. Hikers, mostly. Occasionally locals. The official reports always say they wandered off trail, got lost, exposure, accident, that sort of thing." "But you don't believe that?" She met my eyes directly for the first time. "All I know is my granddaddy worked for the Park Service back in the 60s. He told me stories about things they found in those back caves, things that gave him nightmares till the day he died." Before I could ask for details, the front door chimed as another guest entered. The clerk straightened, her manner shifting instantly back to professional politeness. She welcomed the newcomer, then turned back to me with a tight smile. "You should stick to the marked trails for the rest of your stay," she said, her tone making it clear the conversation was over. Much safer that way. I thanked her and returned to my room, my mind racing with what she'd told me and what she hadn't. Forbidden holes, sealed entrances the Park Service didn't acknowledge, people going missing, and that comment about the kind of gatherings decent folks don't discuss. What did that mean? I spent hours that night researching on my laptop, though the motel's Wi-Fi was frustratingly slow. I found plenty of official information about Mammoth Cave's history and geology, but nothing about sealed entrances or local disappearances beyond the occasional tragic accident. If there was something sinister happening in the unmapped sections of the cave system, it wasn't making it onto the internet. As I finally drifted off to sleep, my dreams were filled with dark passages and distant chanting. In the dream, I was lost in a maze of tunnels, following the sound of voices that always seemed just around the next bend. The air grew increasingly putrid as I ventured deeper, and I became aware of something following behind me, something tall and thin that moved silently through the darkness. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the phantom smell of decay still filling my nostrils. The next morning, I woke with a sense of unease still clinging to me like the remnants of a fever. The dreams had been vivid, too vivid, leaving me with fragmented images of narrow stone passageways and the echo of chanting voices. I showered again, letting hot water pound against my skin until it turned pink, trying to wash away the lingering sensation of being watched. Over a tasteless breakfast at the motel's continental spread, I debated what to do. The rational part of me said to forget the whole thing, stick to the official tours, take some photos of stalactites, and enjoy my vacation as planned. But another part, a more primal part that operated on instinct rather than logic, kept circling back to what I'd seen and heard. The unmarked cave entrance, the rhythmic chanting, the tall figure in the woods, the motel clerk's whispered warnings about the forbidden holes. I decided to split the difference. I'd avoid that particular trail for now, but I'd keep my ears open. Maybe talk to some locals about the legends surrounding the park. Folklore often contained kernels of truth, distorted by time and retelling. I spent the morning on one of the official cave tours, the Domes and Dripstones route. This group was smaller than yesterday's, and our guide was a young woman named Sarah, probably a college student working a summer job. She was enthusiastic about the cave's geology, pointing out particularly impressive formations and explaining how they had formed over thousands of years. At one point, we entered a massive chamber where the ceiling soared up into darkness beyond the reach of the installed lighting. Sarah explained that this dome had been formed by an underground waterfall over millennia. As the group moved on to examine a cluster of stalagmites, I lingered, staring up into the blackness above. Impressive, isn't it? A voice beside me made me start. It was an older man, probably in his 70s, who had been part of our tour group. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. It's hard to comprehend the time scale, I replied. Thousands of years of water dripping, carving all this out, he nodded, still looking upward. What's harder to comprehend is how much of this system remains unmapped. Hundreds of miles charted, but there could be just as many we've never seen. I glanced at him, curious about his choice of words. Are you a local? Born and raised, he confirmed. Worked for the Park Service for 40 years before retiring. I've seen parts of Mammoth that no tourist ever will. This was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. I heard something about sealed entrances around the park perimeter, called the Forbidden Holes. The man's expression shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes, the same reaction I'd seen from the motel clerk. Where'd you hear about those? Just local talk, I said vaguely. I was curious. He was silent for a moment, then gestured for us to follow the rest of the group, who were already moving toward the next chamber. As we walked, he spoke quietly, almost under his breath. Some things are best left alone. The holes were sealed for good reason. What reason? I pressed. He stopped walking, turning to face me directly. His eyes, pale blue and watery with age, were suddenly hard. You're not from around here, so I'll give you some advice, he said, his voice low but intense. Don't go looking for the forbidden holes. Don't ask about them. And if you find one by accident, you turn around and you walk away. Understand? Before I could respond, he moved ahead to rejoin the group, leaving me standing alone in the dimly lit passage. His warning only intensified my curiosity, but it also sent a chill down my spine. This was the second person who had reacted with alarm to my questions about the sealed entrances. The rest of the tour passed without incident, though I was now hyper-aware of the unmarked side passages we occasionally passed. Some were blocked by metal gates or stone barriers, others simply left in darkness, unmentioned by our guide. Each time we passed one, I found myself wondering, what lies beyond? And are all the passages truly sealed? Or are some still accessible to those who know where to look? After the tour, I decided to get some fresh air and perspective. I drove to the Green River, which winds through the park, to rent a kayak for the afternoon. The outfitter was a sunburned man with a tangled beard who hardly spoke as he took my payment and pointed me toward a row of plastic boats pulled up on the muddy bank. The river was calm, its surface a dull green that perfectly matched its name. Paddling downstream required minimal effort, allowing me to take in the scenery. Limestone bluffs rising from the water's edge, dense forest covering the gentle hills, the occasional opening where smaller streams fed into the main channel. It was peaceful, a welcome contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the caves and my increasingly disturbing interactions with the locals. About an hour into my paddle, I spotted a group of people on the riverbank ahead, 5 or 6 college-aged kids, with kayaks pulled up on a small gravel beach. They had a small fire going, smoke rising in a thin column through the trees. As I approached, one of them waved, inviting me to join them. I pulled my kayak up beside theirs and introduced myself. They were students from the University of Kentucky, they explained, on a weekend camping trip. They had coolers of beer and a portable speaker playing music, creating a cheerful atmosphere that felt refreshingly normal after the strangeness of the past day. As we sat around the fire, conversation flowed easily. I mentioned I was staying in Cave City, exploring Mammoth Cave. One of the students, a lanky guy named James, perked up at this. You doing the tourist routes, or going off-trail? He asked, passing me a beer. Mostly the official tours, I replied, deciding to test the waters. Though I did stumble across what looked like an unmarked entrance yesterday. The group exchanged glances, a sudden tension in the air that hadn't been there a moment before. A girl with a blonde ponytail, I think her name was Ashley, leaned forward. Where was this? She asked, her voice pitched lower than before. I described the location as best I could. As I spoke, their expressions grew increasingly serious. That sounds like one of the forbidden holes, Tyler said when I finished. Did you go inside? No, I admitted, but I heard something. Like voices. Another exchange of glances. One of the other guys, whose name I hadn't caught, abruptly stood and walked to the river's edge, as if he no longer wanted to be part of the conversation. You probably shouldn't go back there, Amber said. There are stories. What kind of stories? I prompted when she trailed off. Tyler took a long swig of his beer before answering. You ever hear about the cannibal cults of Mammoth Cave? I shook my head. It's old stuff mostly. Tales from the early 20th century that never really died. According to the stories, there's a group that's been using the deepest parts of the cave system for generations. People who live differently than the rest of us. Differently how? I asked, though I was already connecting the dots. The motel clerk's reference to gatherings decent folks don't discuss. The rancid smell of meat from the cave entrance. The chanting. They say the cult practices ritual cannibalism, Amber said bluntly. That they capture hikers, tourists, sometimes even locals who ask too many questions. That's just local folklore, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Every tourist spot has its urban legends. Maybe, Tyler conceded. But it's weird how the Park Service blocks off certain trails with no explanation sometimes, and people do disappear around here more often than they should. Not just that, another student chimed in, a girl with dark hair and serious eyes. My uncle works for the sheriff's department. He says there are official-looking vehicles that show up in the park sometimes, well off the main roads. Black SUVs with government plates, always at odd hours of the night. What government agency? I asked. She shrugged. He doesn't know, or won't say. But they're not Park Service, and they're not local or state police. The conversation moved on to other topics after that, but the information simmered in my mind. Cannibal cults, government vehicles, sealed cave entrances. It sounded like the plot of a bad horror movie, not something that could be happening in a national park in 2023. And yet, the smell from that cave entrance had been unmistakably organic, the voices I'd heard undeniably human, and the tall figure watching me from the trees had been no hallucination. As evening approached, we said our goodbyes, and I paddled back upstream to return my kayak. The river seemed different now, darker, more secretive. Several times I had the distinct sensation of being watched from the dense foliage along the banks. Once, I paused my paddling, letting the kayak drift silently, and I could have sworn I heard movement in the undergrowth, something large pushing through the brush parallel to the river. But when I stared hard at the shoreline, I saw nothing. By the time I returned the kayak and drove back to Cave City, night had fallen. The small town seemed unnaturally quiet. Most businesses already closed, few people on the streets. On impulse, I drove past my motel to a bar I'd spotted earlier, a weathered building with a neon beer sign flickering in the window. The lot had only a few cars, but the lights were on. Inside, the bar was dim and smoky despite Kentucky's indoor smoking ban. A few locals sat at the counter, hunched over their drinks. Country music played softly from speakers mounted in the corners. I took a stool at the far end of the bar, ordered a whiskey, and nursed it slowly, observing the room's occupants. About 20 minutes later, a man in work clothes took the stool beside mine, though there were plenty of empty seats available. He was in his 40s, with calloused hands and the muscular build of someone who did physical labor for a living. He ordered a beer, then turned to study me openly. "You're staying over at the Wayfarer Motel," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, immediately on guard. "How did you know that?" "Small town," he replied with a shrug. "You were asking Jessica about the forbidden holes." Again, not a question. News traveled fast in Cave City, apparently. I stumbled across what might have been one yesterday, I admitted. I was curious. The man took a long drink of his beer, his eyes never leaving my face. When he set the glass down, he leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I used to work for an excavation crew," he said, "contracted by a government agency about 7 years ago. They didn't tell us much about what we were doing, but we were running subterranean surveys near the park." "What kind of surveys?" I asked, intrigued. "Looking for abnormalities," they said. "Gaps in the rock that shouldn't be there. Chambers that didn't connect to the main system." He traced a pattern in the condensation on his glass. "We found some too. Deep ones." "Which agency was this?" His expression closed off immediately. "They didn't say, and we didn't ask. The pay was good." I sensed he was about to clam up entirely, so I changed tack. "Did you ever hear anything about groups using the unmapped sections of the cave?" His eyes darted around the bar before returning to me. "We weren't supposed to talk about what we found down there, but you did find something." He drained the last of his beer and stood abruptly. "You seem like a decent person, so I'm going to give you some advice. Leave town tomorrow. Go see Ruby Falls in Tennessee, or Carlsbad in New Mexico. Lots of caves in this country that aren't mammoth." With that, he walked out, leaving me more perplexed than before. It was like he'd said too much already, and was regretting even starting the conversation. I stayed at the bar another hour, hoping he might return, or that someone else might be willing to talk. But the other patrons kept to themselves, and the bartender rebuffed my attempts at conversation with monosyllabic responses. By the time I left, the street was deserted, the only sound the distant rumble of a freight train passing through town. Back at my motel, I kept replaying what I'd heard. and an uneasy dread settled in my gut. I opened my laptop to do a bit of research, but the Wi-Fi was spotty, cutting out every few minutes. I managed to confirm what I already knew, that Mammoth Cave is the world's longest cave system, with over 400 miles of surveyed passages. But I found nothing about sealed entrances, government surveys, or disappearances beyond the occasional news report of hikers lost in the park, most later found safe. I recalled reading somewhere that Mammoth Cave is the world's longest cave system, with miles and miles still unexplored. The idea that a hidden cult could use uncharted chambers isn't entirely off the table, especially if they knew the layout better than any official guide. And if it was a cannibal cult or something similarly horrific, maybe the hush-hush presence of a government agency was there to keep it under wraps. The thought made my skin crawl. As I lay in bed that night, trying to sleep, I found myself straining to hear any sound from outside my room. Every creak of the old building, every passing car on the distant highway, set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about the tall figure I'd seen in the woods, imagining it standing in the parking lot, watching my window. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were again filled with dark passages and the echo of rhythmic chanting, now punctuated by the wet sounds of something feeding. I woke before dawn, pulled from sleep by a noise I couldn't identify. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, ears straining in the darkness. There it was again, a soft scraping against the door of my motel room, like fingernails lightly dragging across the wood. I held my breath, listening. The sound came once more, then silence. Heart pounding, I slid out of bed and crept to the door. The peephole showed only the dimly lit parking lot, empty save for a few cars. No one standing outside my door. I hesitated, hand on the deadbolt, then decided against opening it. Instead, I checked that the chain was secured, then returned to bed, sitting upright against the headboard until the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains. By morning, I'd convinced myself the sound had been nothing. A tree branch blown against the building, perhaps, or an animal scurrying along the exterior wall. But the unease lingered as I dressed and packed my day pack for another hike. I was operating on too little sleep, my nerves frayed from 2 nights of disturbing dreams and the increasingly strange encounters with locals. Over breakfast at a diner in town, I mapped out my plan for the day. I would explore a more established trail in the national park, hoping to find some sign of the path I'd stumbled upon 2 days ago. Perhaps in daylight, with a clearer head, I could make sense of what I'd seen and heard. The trail I chose was well-marked and popular, judging by the number of cars in the parking area. I set out at a leisurely pace, the morning sun filtering through the canopy overhead, casting dappled shadows on the path. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Normal sounds, reassuring after the unnatural silence I'd experienced before. I hiked for nearly 2 hours, taking photographs and consulting my map at regular intervals. Despite my efforts, I couldn't locate the unmarked path that had led to the cave entrance. Everything looked the same: thick undergrowth and towering hardwoods, limestone outcroppings breaking through the forest floor, the occasional clearing where sunlight reached ground level. As I paused to drink water and check my map yet again, I noticed a park ranger vehicle parked along a gravel maintenance road that ran parallel to the hiking trail. The ranger, a woman in the standard uniform, was standing beside her truck, binoculars raised as she scanned the forest canopy. Birdwatching, perhaps, or monitoring wildlife. On impulse, I left the trail and approached her. She lowered the binoculars as I drew near, her expression professionally neutral. "Good morning," I called, trying to sound like a casual hiker. "Beautiful day," she nodded. "Can I help you with something, sir?" "I hope so," I said. "I'm trying to find a path I stumbled across the other day. It branched off from one of the main trails, but I can't seem to locate it again." "Which trail were you on?" she asked, her tone still neutral but with an undercurrent of something else, caution perhaps. I described the location as best I could, watching her face for any reaction. As I mentioned the approximate area where I'd found the unmarked path, I saw it, a subtle tightening around her eyes, the same reaction I'd seen from the motel clerk and the retired Park Service employee. "There are no official side trails in that area," she said when I finished. "You must have followed a game trail by mistake. We recommend staying on marked paths for your safety." "I'm pretty sure it wasn't a game trail," I pressed. "It led to what looked like a cave entrance, not one that's part of any tour." The ranger's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, all cave entrances within the national park are documented and either developed for tours or sealed for conservation purposes or due to safety hazards. If you believe you found an unsecured entrance, I'd appreciate the exact location so we can investigate." Her tone was still professional, but there was a new edge to it. She was lying, I was certain of it. The way she avoided direct eye contact, the careful phrasing of her response. She knew exactly what I was talking about. "It was probably nothing," I said, backing off. "Like you said, a game trail. I got turned around. She nodded, seeming relieved that I wasn't pushing further. It happens to the best of us. The forest can be disorienting if you're not familiar with it. We chatted for another minute about trail conditions and weather forecasts, the conversation deliberately mundane. As I turned to leave, however, she called after me, "Sir, a word of advice." I paused, looking back at her. Mammoth Cave National Park is a beautiful place, but it can be dangerous for those who don't respect its boundaries. Stick to the marked trails and official tours for the remainder of your visit. Her voice was pleasant, but her eyes were cold. For your own safety. It was the third warning I'd received, each more direct than the last. As I hiked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Several times, I stopped suddenly and turned around, half expecting to see the tall figure from the woods. There was never anyone there, but the sensation of being watched persisted. That afternoon, restless and increasingly paranoid, I decided to drive around the perimeter of the park. The main roads skirt the boundaries in places, occasionally offering glimpses of the forest interior through breaks in the trees. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, perhaps another unmarked entrance, or some sign of the government presence the students had mentioned. After about an hour of aimless driving, I found myself near Nolan Lake, a small body of water on the park's eastern edge. A cluster of summer cabins dotted the shoreline, most of them simple structures built decades ago. A few had docks extending into the lake, where boats were tied up. I parked at a small public access point and walked along the shore. An older man was sitting on the porch of one of the nearest cabins, watching me with the mild curiosity of someone with nothing better to do. I waved, and after a moment's hesitation, he waved back. "Nice afternoon," I called as I approached his property line. "That it is," he agreed. "You staying at one of the rentals?" I shook my head. "Just visiting the area, touring Mammoth Cave." He nodded, unsurprised. Tourism was clearly the main reason outsiders came to this part of Kentucky. Seeing the usual attractions, I suppose. Something in his phrasing caught my attention. "Mostly, though I'm also interested in the less visited areas. I heard there might be cave entrances around the lake." The man's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Who told you that?" "Just something I read online," I lied. "About multiple entrances to the system scattered throughout the area." He studied me for a long moment, then gestured to a chair beside his on the porch. "Why don't you come sit a spell?" I accepted the invitation, climbing the weathered steps to the porch. Up close, I could see he was older than I'd first thought, well into his 70s, his face deeply lined from a lifetime of sun exposure, his hands spotted with age. "Name's William," he said, offering one of those spotted hands to shake. "Jem," I replied, giving him the fake name I'd been using since arriving in Cave City. Something had made me cautious about revealing too much about myself. Earl reached beside his chair and produced a thermos, pouring amber liquid into a plastic cup. "Bourbon," he explained, offering it to me. "Local stuff." I accepted the drink, taking a small sip. It was surprisingly good, smooth with notes of caramel and oak. We sat in silence for a few minutes, looking out over the lake where the late afternoon sun was casting long reflections on the water's surface. "My family's had this cabin since 1952, Earl finally said. "My grandfather built it himself. He used to take me fishing on this lake when I was a boy." I made an encouraging noise, sensing he was working his way around to something. "He told me stories about this place," Earl continued, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were seeing into the past. "Some of them were just tall tales to scare a kid, I figured, but others," he trailed off, taking a sip of his bourbon. "What kind of stories?" I prompted. Earl's gaze shifted from the lake to me, assessing. Whatever he saw in my face must have satisfied him, because he nodded slightly and continued. "My grandfather swore he saw things around this lake, especially at night. Said once, back in the summer of '47, he was coming back late from checking his trot lines. It was past midnight, no moon. He was rowing along the shoreline when he saw them." "Saw what?" I asked, though I had a chilling suspicion I knew the answer. "A group of figures," Earl said, his voice lower now, "standing by a rock outcropping about a quarter-mile from here. They were wearing robes," he said, with hoods pulled up, moving in and out of a gap in the rocks that he swore hadn't been there the day before. The description matched the tall figure I'd seen in the woods. "Did he get a look at their faces?" Earl shook his head. "He wasn't fool enough to get closer. Said he pulled his boat into a stand of reeds and watched them. There were 5 or 6 of them, all tall and thin. They were carrying something wrapped in cloth, something that dripped." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm afternoon. "What did they do with it?" "Took it into the opening in the rocks. My grandfather said he could hear them, chanting, he called it, a sound like no church service he'd ever attended." Earl drained his cup and immediately refilled it. The next morning he went back to the spot, found remnants of a slaughtered deer near the entrance with strange symbols carved into the hide. At least, he hoped it was a deer. "What do you mean?" Earl's eyes met mine directly. "The bones were wrong," he said. "Too long for a deer. and the skull was missing entirely. We sat in silence as I absorbed this. It aligned too perfectly with what I'd experienced. The chanting from the cave entrance, the foul smell of decay, the tall, robed figure in the woods. "Do you believe his story?" I asked finally. Earl shrugged. "My grandfather wasn't a man given to exaggeration. He was a deacon at the Baptist church, sober as a judge. If he said he saw robed figures carrying something bloody into a cave at midnight, I'm inclined to believe him." "Have you ever seen anything similar?" "Can't say that I have," Earl admitted. "But I've never gone looking, either. Some things are best left alone." He gave me a shrewd look, which is advice you might want to consider if you're poking around asking about hidden cave entrances. "I'm just curious," I said, trying to sound casual. "I find local folklore interesting." Earl clearly didn't believe me. "Well, let me tell you something about folklore, Jim. It usually exists for a reason. Sometimes it's to explain natural phenomena people didn't understand. But sometimes it's a warning, wrapped up in a story so it's easier to remember and pass down." "A warning about what?" "About places you shouldn't go. Things you shouldn't disturb." Earl's voice had taken on an edge of genuine concern. "I don't know what's really in those sealed caves. Maybe nothing. Maybe just some weird rock formations that spooked my grandfather on a dark night. But I do know that people who go looking for trouble around here have a habit of finding it." The conversation shifted to safer topics after that. Fishing conditions on the lake, the history of the area, Earl's grandchildren who visited every summer. But as the shadows lengthened and I prepared to leave, he caught my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man his age. "One more thing," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If you do go near those caves again and you smell something foul, like meat gone bad, you turn around and you run. Don't look back, don't stop to take pictures, just run." I promised I would, thanked him for the bourbon and the conversation, and walked back to my car. As I drove away, I could see him in my rearview mirror, still standing on his porch, watching me until I turned a bend in the road and disappeared from view. I was torn between thinking all of this was some elaborate local legend and genuinely fearing that I'd brushed up against something horrifyingly real. The retired excavation worker's comments about government surveys, the students' tales of black SUVs and missing hikers, Earl's story about robed figures carrying something that dripped blood, the motel clerk's warning about gatherings decent folks don't discuss. It all pointed to something sinister happening in the unmapped sections of Mammoth Cave. On the drive back to Cave City, I tried to organize my thoughts. There were too many coincidences, too many stories that aligned with what I'd experienced personally. The chanting I'd heard from the cave entrance had been real. The tall figure watching me from the woods had been real. The stench of decay had been real. But a cannibal cult operating in a national park in 2023? It seemed absurd, like something from a bad horror movie. Yet I couldn't dismiss the possibility entirely. Remote areas have always been havens for groups that want to operate outside society's norms. And if there was indeed some kind of government involvement, some agency running subterranean surveys, as the man at the bar had described, it suggested something even more disturbing. Official awareness, possibly even containment rather than elimination. Back at the motel, I ate a solitary dinner from a fast food bag, spreading my notes and the park map on the bed. I'd been marking locations mentioned in the various stories I'd heard. The area where I'd found the unmarked path, the section of Nolan Lake where Earl's grandfather had seen the robed figures, places where hikers had reportedly gone missing in recent years. A pattern was emerging. The incidents clustered around the park's perimeter, away from the heavily trafficked tourist areas but often near bodies of water. The Green River, Nolan Lake, smaller streams that fed into them. Limestone is soluble in water. The cave system itself had been formed by underground waterways dissolving the rock over millennia. It made sense that additional entrances might be found near surface water features. As I studied the map, a chill ran down my spine. The locations formed a rough circle around the central portion of the park, almost as if they were access points to a separate section of the cave system, one that wasn't connected to the tourist routes at all, or perhaps one that had been deliberately isolated from them. I recalled what the retired excavation worker had said about abnormalities and chambers that didn't connect to the main system. What if there was an entire network of caves beneath Mammoth that wasn't on any official map? A section that could be accessed only through these forbidden holes scattered around the park's boundaries? The implications were disturbing. Such a hidden network could provide the perfect sanctuary for a group that wanted to remain undetected while still being able to move throughout the area. The caves would offer shelter, concealment, and if the entrances were well hidden or disguised, near perfect security from outsiders. I was getting ahead of myself, spinning theories based on fragments of local legend and my own unsettling experiences. I needed more concrete information, but who could I trust to provide it? The park rangers were clearly part of whatever conspiracy of silence surrounded the sealed entrances. The locals who knew anything substantial were reluctant to talk. warning me away rather than sharing details. One name kept surfacing in my thoughts: the excavation worker from the bar. He had direct experience with whatever government agency was investigating the caves. He'd hinted at findings that weren't supposed to be discussed. If anyone could confirm or disprove my growing suspicions, it would be him, but I didn't even know his name, let alone how to find him. Cave City was small, but not so small that I could easily track down one anonymous man based solely on his former occupation. I'd have to return to the bar and hope he showed up again. Or perhaps ask the bartender about him. As I was contemplating this, my laptop chimed with an incoming email. The Wi-Fi was working again, apparently. I opened my inbox to find a message from an address I didn't recognize, just a string of numbers and letters at a generic provider. The subject line was blank. The message contained only an image file. Cautiously, I downloaded and opened it. It was a photograph of a cave interior, taken with a flash that harshly illuminated the foreground while leaving the background in deep shadow. The limestone walls were covered in symbols, crude pictographs reminiscent of prehistoric cave paintings, but with a disturbing difference. These depicted humanoid figures engaged in what could only be ritual butchery of other human forms. In the center of the image was a stone altar, its surface stained dark. I stared at the photo, my heart racing. This was either evidence of something genuinely horrific or an elaborate hoax meant to frighten me. But who would go to such lengths, and how had they gotten my email address? The timestamp in the image metadata was from 3 years ago. The GPS coordinates had been stripped, but there was a file name that might be significant. FC7, IFT3, LR4. It meant nothing to me, but it had the structured feel of a cataloging system. As I studied the image more closely, I noticed something in the shadowed background. A partial figure, standing just at the edge of the flash's reach, tall and thin, wearing what appeared to be a hooded robe. The face was mercifully obscured by darkness, but the proportions were wrong somehow. The arms too long, the shoulders too narrow for its height. I closed the laptop abruptly, suddenly certain I was being watched. The motel room felt too exposed, with its thin curtains and flimsy door lock. Anyone could be standing in the dark parking lot, observing the silhouette I cast against the drawn shades. I checked that the door was locked and the chain secured, then did the same with the window, though it was far too small for anyone to climb through. Still, the sense of vulnerability persisted. I kept the bathroom light on when I finally went to bed, unable to face complete darkness after what I'd seen. Sleep came in fitful bursts, repeatedly broken by the smallest sounds: the hum of the air conditioner cycling on, a car passing on the distant highway, the ice machine down the hall rumbling to life. Each time I drifted off, I dreamed of narrow stone passages and hooded figures moving in darkness. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I was running through the cave system, pursued by something I couldn't see but could hear. A wet, sliding sound punctuated by a chittering noise that was almost but not quite laughter. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs. The bathroom light still burned, but it seemed dimmer somehow, as if struggling against a darkness that was more than just the absence of light. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of sunrise, but the parking lot remained in deep shadow. As I lay there trying to calm my racing heart, I became aware of a sound, faint but distinct, a low rhythmic chanting, barely audible through the motel room wall. It could have been a television in the next room, or music played at low volume, but I knew it wasn't. It was the same cadence I'd heard emanating from the cave entrance in the woods, a sound that had no place here, in a roadside motel at dawn. I dressed quickly, throwing my belongings into my bag. Whatever was happening in Cave City, whatever secret lurked beneath Mammoth Cave, I wanted no further part of it. I would check out, drive back to Louisville, and catch the first available flight home. The vacation was over, but even as I made this decision, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that it might already be too late, that perhaps I'd been marked from the moment I strayed from the marked path and found that hidden entrance, that the tall figures in the woods had been watching me ever since, following my movements, waiting for the right moment to ensure I didn't share what I'd seen. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on the practical task of packing. I would be on the road within 20 minutes, leaving Cave City and its secrets far behind. Whatever was in those caves, whatever the gatherings involved, whatever government agency was monitoring or containing the situation, it was no longer my concern, or so I desperately tried to convince myself as I zipped my bag closed, the faint chanting still audible through the wall. I left the motel at first light, tossing my room key through the night drop slot without bothering to check out properly. The parking lot was empty save for a few vehicles, probably belonging to other guests, still asleep in their rooms. As I loaded my bag into the trunk, I had the distinct sensation of being observed, though I could see no one. The windows of the neighboring rooms were dark, their curtains drawn. The sensation persisted as I slid behind the wheel and started the engine. A movement in my peripheral vision made me turn sharply, but it was only a plastic bag drifting across the asphalt in the early morning breeze. Still, as I pulled onto the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that my departure was being noted. I'd planned to drive straight to Louisville, about 2 hours away, and catch the first available flight, regardless of destination. But as I approached the interstate on-ramp, a strange compulsion took hold. I found myself thinking of the email I'd received, the disturbing photograph with its strange file name, FC753L4. What did it mean, and who had sent it? Almost against my will, I bypassed the on-ramp and continued along the rural highway that skirted the edge of the national park. One last drive around the perimeter, I told myself. One last attempt to make sense of what I'd experienced. Then I would leave for good. The morning was misty, fog clinging to the hollows and low spots, obscuring the forest beyond the first line of trees. The effect was disorienting, making familiar landmarks seem alien and ominous. I drove slowly, watching for the road signs that marked the park's boundaries. About 20 minutes into this unplanned detour, I spotted something through a momentary break in the fog, a black SUV parked on a narrow dirt track that led into the forest. Government plates. Just like the college students had described, my heart rate accelerated as I slowed the car, trying to get a better look without being obvious. The track wasn't marked on my map, nor was there any sign indicating a park facility or service road. It was simply a gap in the trees, easily missed if you weren't looking for it. The SUV was parked about 50 yards in, just visible from the highway. As I watched, a figure emerged from the passenger side, a man in a dark suit, carrying what looked like specialized equipment. He glanced in my direction, and I quickly accelerated, not wanting to be caught staring. In my rearview mirror, I saw him speaking into a handheld radio, still looking toward the highway, toward me. I kept driving, fighting the urge to speed. The last thing I needed was to be pulled over for a traffic violation, but my mind was racing. The black SUV confirmed at least part of what I'd heard. There was indeed some kind of official presence in the area, operating away from the public areas of the park. I continued along the highway, now hyper-aware of any vehicles that appeared behind me. After about 15 minutes, I spotted another dirt track leading into the forest. On impulse, I turned onto it, driving just far enough to be hidden from the highway. I cut the engine and sat in silence, listening to the soft ticking of the cooling motor and the distant calls of birds awakening in the forest. The file name from the email kept repeating in my mind, FC783LOR4. If it was a cataloging system, what was it categorizing? Locations, entrances, and what did FC stand for? Forbidden Cave. The realization hit me with such clarity that I gasped aloud. FC, Forbidden Cave. The 7 might indicate a specific cave or entrance, and E3L4 perhaps coordinates within the cave system itself. Entrance 3, Level 4. It was a stretch, but it felt right. Someone had sent me a photograph of the interior of what they were calling Forbidden Cave 7, taken at Entrance 3, Level 4. But why send it to me? Was it a warning? Evidence? Or was someone trying to lure me deeper into whatever mystery surrounded the sealed entrances? I sat in my parked car, debating what to do. The rational choice was still to leave, drive to Louisville, fly home, forget everything I'd seen and heard. But another part of me, the part that had been drawn to the eerie hush of underground caverns in the first place, wanted answers, needed them. My thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of an engine. I tensed, listening as it grew louder. A vehicle was coming down the dirt track from the direction of the forest, not the highway. I shrank down in my seat, hoping to avoid detection. Through the trees I caught glimpses of another black SUV, similar to the one I'd seen earlier. It passed within 20 yards of where I was parked, close enough that I could see the driver, a woman with short gray hair and sunglasses, her expression impassive. In the passenger seat was a man in a dark suit, looking down at something in his lap, perhaps a tablet or laptop. Neither of them glanced in my direction, and after a moment, the SUV turned onto the highway and disappeared. I waited several minutes to ensure they were truly gone before starting my engine again. But instead of returning to the highway, I made an impulsive decision. I continued down the dirt track in the direction from which the SUV had come. The track was rough, clearly not maintained for regular traffic. Branches scraped against the sides of my car, and ruts in the dirt threatened to bottom out my chassis. After about a mile, the track ended in a small clearing. There was nothing obvious to indicate why government agents would be here. No buildings, no equipment, not even a trail marker. I parked and got out, listening intently. The forest was quiet, but not with the unnatural silence I'd experienced before. This was the normal quiet of early morning, punctuated by bird calls and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. At the far side of the clearing, I noticed a faint path leading into the trees. It wasn't a formal trail, just a slight depression in the forest floor where vegetation had been repeatedly trampled. Curiosity overcame caution, and I followed it. The path wound through the forest for about 10 minutes before ending abruptly at a limestone outcropping. The rock face was perhaps 20 feet high, covered in moss and lichen. It looked natural, unremarkable, except for a narrow fissure at its base, partially hidden by a fallen log. The fissure was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they turned sideways. A cool draft emerged from it, carrying the mineral scent of the cave system. There was no sign, no barrier, nothing to indicate this was an entrance to anything, but the trampled path leading directly to it suggested otherwise. I approached cautiously, shining my phone's flashlight into the opening. The beam illuminated a tight passage that appeared to widen a few feet in. The walls were smooth limestone, showing signs of water erosion over thousands of years. This was no recent excavation. It was a natural formation, a genuine entrance to the cave system. Standing at the threshold, I hesitated. Every warning I'd received urged caution. The motel clerk, the retired Park Service employee, the ranger, Earl from the lakeside cabin, all had advised staying away from the sealed entrances. And yet here I was, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't fully explain, staring into the darkness of what might well be one of the forbidden holes. I thought of the email, the disturbing photograph with its images of ritual butchery. If FC7 under D3 under L4 really did refer to a location within the cave system, this might be connected to it. Perhaps even the same entrance. Common sense finally reasserted itself. I had no proper equipment for cave exploration. No helmet, no backup light source, no rope. Entering a wild cave alone, without telling anyone where I was going, was a recipe for disaster even without the additional complications of possible cult activity or government surveillance. I backed away from the fissure, intending to return to my car and reconsider my options. Perhaps I could find a local guide willing to talk, someone who knew the wild sections of the cave system but wasn't connected to the Park Service. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a symbol carved into the rock face about 6 feet above the fissure. It had been weathered by time and partially obscured by lichen, but it was unmistakably a deliberate marking. A circle with a vertical line through it, and smaller marks arranged around the perimeter. It matched one of the symbols I'd seen in the emailed photograph. I quickly took several pictures with my phone, backing up to capture both the symbol and its position relative to the cave entrance. As I was focusing for one last shot, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Through the trees, perhaps 50 yards away, stood a figure, tall and thin, wearing what appeared to be a dark robe or coat that reached the ground, just like the figure I'd glimpsed in the woods days earlier. For a moment, we both remained motionless, regarding each other across the distance. Then the figure began to move, not toward me, but parallel to my position, circling around the clearing while maintaining the same distance. Its movement was fluid, almost gliding, as if its feet barely touched the ground. I backed toward the limestone outcropping, keeping my eyes on the figure. It continued its arc around the clearing, never approaching directly but never retreating either. Watching, assessing. When it had moved about 90 degrees from its original position, it stopped again. Now I could see it more clearly through a gap in the trees. The robe was not black as I'd first thought, but a deep, dark red, the color of dried blood. The hood was pulled forward, keeping the face in shadow, but I could see hands emerging from the sleeves, pale, with fingers that seemed too long, too thin to be entirely human. Fear jolted through me like an electric current. Without conscious thought, I turned and ran, no longer concerned with the path, simply crashing through the undergrowth in what I hoped was the direction of my car. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore at my clothing, but I didn't slow. Behind me I heard nothing, no pursuit, no crashing through the forest, which somehow made it worse. If the figure was following, it was doing so silently, efficiently. I burst into the clearing where I'd parked, gasping for breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. My car sat where I'd left it, undisturbed. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door and throw myself inside. As I started the engine, I scanned the edge of the clearing frantically. Nothing. No sign of the robed figure, no movement in the trees. I reversed in a spray of dirt and dead leaves, then sped back down the rough track toward the highway, branches scraping against the car's paint as I careened around curves. Only when I reached the paved road did I slow, taking deep breaths to calm myself. What had I seen? Was it a person, a member of the rumored cult, or something else entirely? The proportions had been wrong, the movements unnatural, but that could be explained by a costume, by practiced movement meant to intimidate and frighten. I turned onto the highway, heading toward Cave City rather than away from it. My earlier resolve to leave immediately had been replaced by a burning need to understand what was happening. The symbol on the rock face, the robed figure, the black SUVs, it all pointed to something real, not just local legend or my overactive imagination. Back in town, I found a small coffee shop and settled at a corner table with my laptop. The Wi-Fi here was stronger than at the motel, allowing me to research more effectively. I started by searching for information about cults associated with cave systems, particularly in Kentucky. Most results were either academic papers on prehistoric cave use by indigenous peoples, or sensationalized articles about satanic panic incidents from the 1980s. Nothing that matched what I'd experienced. I refined my search, looking specifically for references to ritual cannibalism in American folk traditions. This yielded more useful information. There were indeed historical accounts of isolated communities in Appalachia and the Ozarks that had been accused of cannibalistic practices in the 18th and 19th centuries. Most historians dismissed these as propaganda meant to demonize backward rural populations, but the persistence of the stories across different regions suggested at least some kernel of truth. One article mentioned a group called the Hungry Ones that had allegedly lived in caves along the Kentucky-Tennessee border in the 1850s. According to local legends, they would emerge at night to abduct travelers, dragging them back to their underground dwellings for ritual consumption. The author cited court records from Barron County, Kentucky, the very county where Mammoth Cave is located, documenting the trial of 3 men accused of belonging to this group. All 3 were hanged in 1857. The article included a sketch from a 19th century newspaper showing the accused in the courtroom. They were described as uncommonly tall and gaunt, with an unhealthy pallor, as if they had indeed spent their lives beneath the earth, hidden from God's light. The sketch depicted them wearing high-collared coats that reached to the floor, not unlike the robed figure I'd seen in the woods. I dug deeper, looking for more recent accounts. A forum for cave explorers yielded a thread from 2011 where spelunkers discussed rumors of restricted or forbidden sections of Mammoth Cave. Most participants dismissed the idea as fantasy, but one user, posting under the name Deep Dweller, claimed to have found entrances to parts of the system that weren't on any official map. There are chambers down there that the Park Service doesn't want you to know about, Deep Dweller had written. Places where the walls are covered in symbols that don't match any known indigenous artwork. I found evidence of recent habitation, fire pits, refuse, even what looked like sleeping areas. And once, just once, I saw them. Moving through a passage about a half-mile in from entrance FC7, tall figures in dark robes. They didn't see me, thank God. I hid behind a formation until they passed. There were 5 of them, moving in single file. They were carrying something wrapped in cloth, something that left a dark trail on the limestone floor. The account matched Earl's story about his grandfather seeing robed figures by Nolan Lake, almost exactly, right down to the wrapped bundle they carried. And the reference to entrance FC7 aligned with my theory about the find lane in the emailed photograph. Deep Dweller's last post in the thread was an announcement that they were planning a solo expedition to map one of the restricted sections. They promised to post their findings upon return. There were no further posts from that user in the thread, which continued for several more pages with other users speculating about what might have happened. I sat back, processing what I'd learned. If I accepted the reality of what I'd seen and heard, the chanting from the cave entrance, the robed figure in the woods, the black SUVs with government plates, then I had to consider the possibility that the rumors were true, that there was indeed a group using the unmapped sections of Mammoth Cave for purposes unknown, a group that might well be the modern descendants of the Hungry Ones from the 19th century accounts. And if the government knew about them, as the presence of the SUVs suggested, why hadn't they been stopped? What possible reason could there be for monitoring rather than eliminating such a threat, unless the relationship was more complicated than simple awareness? Unless there was some kind of arrangement, a containment protocol rather than eradication. Perhaps the group provided something valuable in exchange for being left alone. Information? Access to parts of the cave system otherwise unreachable? Or something darker, something related to those subterranean surveys the excavation worker had mentioned. The possibilities made my skin crawl. I closed my laptop, suddenly aware that I'd spent over 2 hours in the coffee shop, following digital breadcrumbs that led to increasingly disturbing conclusions. Outside, the day had turned overcast, dark clouds building on the horizon. A storm was moving in. I returned to my car, still parked in front of the coffee shop, and sat behind the wheel, uncertain of my next move. My phone chimed with an incoming email notification. It was from the same anonymous address that had sent the photograph. This time, the message contained only text. You've been marked. They know you're sent now. Leave while you still can. A warning? A threat? Either way, it confirmed my suspicion that I was being watched, my movements tracked. But by whom? The robed figures? The government agents? Both? I decided to take the advice. I would leave Cave City immediately, drive to Louisville, and catch the first available flight. No more detours, no more investigations. I'd seen enough to know that the danger was real, whatever its exact nature. As I started the engine, heavy raindrops began to pelt the windshield. The storm had arrived sooner than expected, the sky darkening to a leaden gray that matched my mood. I pulled onto the main street, heading for the highway that would take me away from Cave City and its secrets. I'd gone less than a mile when I noticed a black SUV in my rearview mirror, identical to the ones I'd seen earlier. It was keeping pace with me, maintaining a constant distance. Not obviously following, but not passing either. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. It could be coincidence. There were probably dozens of similar vehicles in the area. But the timing, coming so soon after the warning email, felt significant. I made a series of random turns through Cave City's modest street grid, watching to see if the SUV would follow. It did, always maintaining the same distance, never aggressive but undeniably present. After the fourth turn, I was certain I was being followed. The rain was falling harder now, reducing visibility and slicking the pavement. I considered my options. I could try to lose them, but in this weather, at these speeds, that was a recipe for an accident. I could pull over and confront them, but if they were government agents, that might lead to detention and questioning. If they were something else, members of the group from the caves, the risk was even greater. My decision was made for me when a second black SUV appeared ahead, pulling out from a side street to block my path. I braked sharply, the car skidding slightly on the wet road. The SUV behind me closed the distance, effectively boxing me in. For a moment I sat frozen, engine idling, windshield wipers slashing frantically at the downpour. Then the doors of both SUVs opened simultaneously. From each vehicle emerged two figures, men in dark suits, moving with the coordinated precision of trained operatives. They approached my car from all sides, giving me no opportunity to accelerate away. One of them, a tall man with close-cropped gray hair and a weathered face, tapped on my driver's side window. His expression was neutral, professional, not threatening, but brooking no argument either. I lowered the window a few inches, rain spattering through the gap. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sir, we need you to come with us," the man said, his tone polite but firm. "There are some questions we'd like to ask you regarding your activities in and around Mammoth Cave National Park." "Who are you?" I demanded. "FBI? Park Service?" The man produced an ID card in a leather wallet. The seal and organization name were unfamiliar, not any federal agency I recognized. "We're with the Subterranean Research and Containment Division," he said, "a joint task force operating under the Department of the Interior. Please step out of the vehicle, sir." I hesitated, weighing my options. Running seemed impossible now, and resistance would likely lead to force. Perhaps cooperation was the safest path, at least until I understood what they wanted from me. "Am I under arrest?" I asked. "No, sir. We're simply requesting your assistance in an ongoing investigation. Your recent activities have intersected with matters of national security." His expression softened slightly. "I understand this must seem alarming, but I assure you, we mean you no harm. We simply need information." Something in his tone convinced me he was telling the truth, or at least part of it. I nodded, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the rain. Immediately, one of the other agents opened an umbrella over my head, while another took my car keys. "Your vehicle will be secure," the gray-haired man assured me. "We'll return it to you when our conversation is concluded." They escorted me to the lead SUV, opening the rear door. As I slid into the back seat, I noticed the windows were tinted dark enough that I couldn't see out clearly. The gray-haired man joined me in the back, while the others returned to their respective vehicles. "I apologize for the dramatic approach," he said as we pulled away from my parked car. "But time is of the essence, and we needed to speak with you privately." "About what?" I asked, still tense, ready for any sign of threat. "About what you've seen in the caves," he replied simply. "About the Watchers." "The Watchers?" I repeated, the term unfamiliar yet somehow fitting for the robed figures I'd encountered. The gray-haired man nodded, his expression grave. "That's what we call them. It's what they've been called for generations, since the first documented encounters in the early 1800s. The SUV moved smoothly through the rain-slicked streets of Cave City, heading toward the outskirts of town. Through the tinted windows, I could see little more than blurred shapes and the occasional flash of headlights from passing vehicles. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, unable to keep the edge of anxiety from my voice. "To a secure location where we can talk freely," he replied. "My name is John Blackwood. I'm the field director for the Subterranean Research and Containment Division's Kentucky operation." "That's quite a mouthful," I remarked, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. "I've never heard of your agency." "Few people have, and that's by design." Blackwood adjusted his position, turning slightly to face me more directly. "We operate with minimal public footprint, reporting directly to a joint oversight committee, rather than through the standard chain of command." "And what exactly does your agency do?" "In simplest terms, we monitor and contain anomalous phenomena associated with cave systems throughout North America. Mammoth Cave is our primary area of operation due to both its size and the frequency of incidents." The clinical language did nothing to mask the ominous implications. By anomalous phenomena, you mean the Watchers, I said. The figures in the robes. Blackwood nodded. Among other things, yes. The Watchers are our primary concern, but there are other elements at play in the deeper sections of the cave system. Geological, ecological, and certain, difficult-to-classify phenomena. The SUV turned onto a gravel road that led away from town, into the densely forested hills that surrounded the national park. The rain continued to fall heavily, drumming on the roof and reducing visibility to a few yards beyond the headlights. You still haven't explained why you've brought me in, I said, or how you knew about my activities, as you put it. Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but I detected a hint of tension around his eyes. We monitor all unsealed entrances to the restricted sections of the cave system. When you approached the entrance near trail marker 37, it triggered an alert. We've been aware of your movement since then. I recalled the hidden path I'd followed days ago, the unmarked cave entrance where I'd heard the chanting. That still doesn't explain why you're interested in me specifically. Surely tourists stumble across these entrances occasionally. They do, Blackwood acknowledged, but most turn back immediately, especially if they detect the distinctive odor that emanates from those openings. You not only approached closely enough to hear activity within, but you've spent the subsequent days actively investigating, questioning locals, researching online, even returning to the forest near another entrance earlier today. His knowledge of my movements was disturbingly comprehensive. You've been watching me this whole time? Not continuously, no. But we have systems in place to flag certain patterns of behavior. Your persistent interest in the sealed entrances raised concerns. He paused, studying my face, particularly after you were marked. The phrase from the anonymous email echoed in my mind. What do you mean, marked? The Watchers identify potential threats through scent, Blackwood explained, his tone matter-of-fact despite the bizarre content. When they detect an outsider near one of their entrances, they dispatch a sentinel to assess the threat level. If the outsider is deemed significant, they're marked. Their scent is recorded and shared among the group. A chill ran down my spine. The figure I saw in the woods? A sentinel, yes. They rarely engage directly. Their primary role is observation and reporting. Reporting to whom? What exactly are these things? Some kind of cult? Blackwood was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. The SUV turned again, now on a narrower track that wound deeper into the forest. Through the rain-streaked windows, I caught glimpses of a chain-link fence running parallel to the road. The Watchers are, he began, then paused, reconsidering his words. The term cult implies a religious or ideological framework that doesn't quite apply here. They're better understood as a distinct population that has adapted to subterranean existence over many generations. You're saying they live in the caves permanently? That they're some kind of cave-dwelling humans? I'm saying they were human, originally. Blackwood's voice was carefully neutral. Records suggest they began as a isolated community in the early 1800s, possibly escaped slaves, outlaws, or a combination of societal outcasts who found refuge in the unmapped sections of the cave system. And now? I pressed. Now they've adapted. Generations of living in perpetual darkness, consuming a specialized diet, inbreeding within a limited population. It changes people, physiologically, psychologically. The implications were horrifying. The specialized diet. You're talking about cannibalism, aren't you? The stories about them abducting people, using them for food. They're true? Blackwood didn't answer directly. Their nutritional requirements are complex. We've established certain protocols that minimize harm to the general population while meeting their essential needs. Protocols? I repeated, disgust rising in my throat. Are you saying your agency actually facilitates? I'm saying we manage a situation that would be catastrophic if left uncontrolled. Blackwood interrupted sharply. The alternatives would be far worse. Either military action that would result in significant casualties on both sides, or allowing the Watchers to hunt indiscriminately. The SUV slowed, approaching a gate in the chain-link fence. A small guard booth stood beside it, manned by an armed individual in a uniform similar to that of a park ranger, but with subtle differences in the patches and insignia. The guard checked something on a tablet, then waved us through. Beyond the fence, the road improved, becoming paved and better maintained. After another quarter-mile, a cluster of buildings came into view. Low, utilitarian structures that resembled a scientific research station more than a military base. The SUV pulled up to the largest building, a two-story facility with few windows and multiple satellite dishes on the roof. We're here, Blackwood announced unnecessarily. Let's continue our conversation inside, where it's dry. I followed him from the vehicle into the building, escorted by two of the agents who had been in the second SUV. The interior was brightly lit and clinically sterile. White walls, polished floors, security cameras at regular intervals. Staff in both civilian clothes and various uniforms moved purposefully through the hallways, barely glancing at our small procession. Blackwood led me to a conference room where a woman was already waiting. She was in her 50s, with short salt and pepper hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She wore a lab coat over business attire, a security badge clipped to her pocket. "This is Dr. Madison Voss, our lead researcher," Blackwood introduced her. "Dr. Voss, this is the individual who's been investigating the FC7 entrance." Dr. Voss studied me with clinical interest. "You've caused quite a stir with your persistence," she remarked. "Few civilians maintain interest after their initial encounter with a sentinel." I remained standing, unwilling to settle into what might become an interrogation. Maybe that's because few civilians have multiple encounters that confirm something very wrong is happening in those caves. Dr. Voss gestured to the chairs around the conference table. "Please, sit. You're not a prisoner here. We brought you in for a conversation, not an interrogation." Reluctantly, I took a seat, positioned so I could see the door. Blackwood and Dr. Voss sat across from me. "Let me be direct," Dr. Voss began. "You've stumbled onto a situation that few outside this facility are aware of. The Watchers have existed in the Mammoth Cave system for at least 2 centuries, possibly longer. They've evolved, or perhaps devolved, into something that exists in a gray area between human and something else." "What do you mean, something else?" I asked. She opened a folder that had been sitting on the table and slid a photograph across to me. It showed what appeared to be a medical examination of one of the robed figures, now stripped of its covering. The body was unnaturally elongated, the limbs too thin and jointed in subtly wrong ways. The skin was a pallid gray-white, almost translucent in places, but most disturbing was the face, recognizably human in its basic structure, but with features that had shifted toward something predatory. The eyes were larger than normal, the pupils dilated to nearly fill the iris. The nose was flattened, with enlarged nostrils. The mouth stretched wider than should be possible, filled with teeth that had grown sharp and irregular. "This specimen was recovered after a tunnel collapse in 1997, Dr. Voss explained. "It represents approximately 7 generations of adaptation to subterranean conditions." I pushed the photograph away, fighting a wave of nausea. "And your agency just studies them? Allows them to continue abducting people?" "As Director Blackwood mentioned, we have protocols in place," Dr. Voss said, her tone still clinically detached. "The situation is managed." "What does that mean exactly?" I demanded. "What kind of protocols could possibly justify allowing these things to continue existing, let alone feeding?" Blackwood and Dr. Voss exchanged a glance. It was Blackwood who answered. "The Watchers provide something in return for our containment rather than eradication approach," he said carefully. "Access to certain resources that exist only in the deepest sections of the cave system. Resources with significant applications." "What resources?" I pressed. "There are formations in the lower levels," Dr. Voss explained. "Crystalline structures with properties unlike anything found elsewhere on Earth. They appear to be biological in origin, though not from any recognized taxonomic group. We believe they're the result of a symbiotic relationship between the Watchers and an undocumented fungal species that exists only in specific chambers of the cave system." "And these crystals are worth letting people be abducted and eaten?" I couldn't keep the disgust from my voice. "No one is being abducted and eaten anymore," Blackwood said firmly. "That's why we established the protocols. The Watchers receive medical waste from partner facilities, biological material that would otherwise be incinerated. Blood, tissue samples, occasionally amputated limbs. It satisfies their nutritional requirements without harming the living." The thought was still revolting, but marginally less horrifying than the alternative. "And in return they let you harvest these crystals?" "They do more than that," Dr. Voss said. "They guide our research teams to new formations, help navigate the unmapped sections of the cave system, and share their specialized knowledge of subterranean environments. It's a symbiotic relationship, not unlike their own with the crystal-producing fungi. The applications are vital to national security," Blackwood added. "The crystals have properties that make them invaluable for certain advanced technologies, communication systems that function in environments where conventional methods fail, medical applications that accelerate healing, energy storage mechanisms that far exceed current battery technology." I sat back, trying to process the implications of what they were telling me. "So you have a deal with these evolved cannibals, you feed them medical waste, and they give you access to some kind of miracle crystal that only grows in their territory." "That's a simplified version, but essentially correct," Dr. Voss confirmed. "And what happens when someone like me stumbles too close to the truth? Do I become part of your medical waste supply?" Blackwood's expression hardened. "That's not how we operate. Civilian encounters are managed through information control, not elimination. Most people who spot a sentinel or find an entrance convince themselves they imagined it, or rationalize it as something mundane. Those who persist are typically redirected through subtle interventions, such as job offers that relocate them, romantic opportunities in distant cities, family emergencies that require immediate attention," Dr. Voss listed. "In cases where the individual is particularly resistant to redirection, we sometimes resort to discreditation, making their claims appear delusional or attention-seeking. And if that doesn't work, I pressed, in rare cases we bring them in, as we did with you, Blackwood said. We explain the situation, impress upon them the national security implications, and request their cooperation in maintaining secrecy. And if I refuse to cooperate? If I decide to share what I've learned? Blackwood leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. Then we would be forced to consider you a security risk. Not to put too fine a point on it, but there are facilities where individuals with knowledge of classified operations are held when they represent an ongoing threat of disclosure. They're not pleasant places. The threat was clear. Cooperate or disappear into some black site detention center. So I don't really have a choice. You always have a choice, Dr. Voss said, her tone softening slightly. But I hope you'll make the one that acknowledges the complex reality we're dealing with. The arrangement we've established with the Watchers has saved lives, both by preventing them from hunting humans and by advancing medical technologies that would otherwise have taken decades to develop. I considered my options. I could agree to their terms, leave Cave City, and try to forget everything I'd seen and heard. Or I could resist and likely find myself detained indefinitely. Neither choice was appealing. What exactly do you want from me? I asked finally. Your silence, primarily, Blackwood replied. Delete any photographs or notes you've taken, cease your investigations, and leave the area. In return, we won't interfere with your life beyond monitoring to ensure compliance. And if I agree, you'll just let me walk away? Return to my normal life like none of this happened? With one caveat, Dr. Voss interjected. You've been marked by a sentinel. The Watchers know you're sent now. While our agreement with them generally prevents them from pursuing marked individuals who leave the area, there's always a risk. I would strongly advise against returning to this region or exploring cave systems elsewhere. They communicate across great distances in ways we don't fully understand. Your scent profile has been shared among their kind. The warning sent a chill down my spine. Are you saying they'd recognize me even in a completely different cave system, in another state? It's a possibility we can't discount, she confirmed. Their olfactory capabilities far exceed human norms, and they have long memories. I sat in silence for a moment, processing everything I'd been told. The existence of the Watchers, the government's arrangement with them, the warning that I'd been permanently marked as known to these creatures. It was overwhelming. I need to know one more thing, I said finally. The email I received with the photograph of the cave interior, the one labeled FC7E3LPL4, was that from one of you? A warning to back off? Blackwood and Dr. Voss exchanged another glance, this one clearly concerned. We didn't send any email, Blackwood said slowly. Can you describe the photograph in detail? I explained what I'd seen, the pictographs on the walls depicting ritual butchery, the stone altar with its stained surface, the partial figure visible in the background. Dr. Voss's expression grew increasingly troubled as I spoke. That location matches a restricted chamber in what we designate as Forbidden Cave 7, accessible through Entrance 3, Level 4, hence the file name. But we haven't had research teams in that section for months, and all photographic material is strictly controlled. Someone within your organization could have leaked it, I suggested. Possible, but unlikely given our security protocols, Blackwood replied. More concerning is the possibility that there's another party aware of both the Watchers and your investigation of them. What other party could possibly know about all this? Neither of them answered immediately. It was Dr. Voss who finally broke the silence. There have been disruptions in our arrangement with the Watchers over the past year, she said carefully. Evidence of unauthorized access to certain chambers, disturbances that neither our teams nor the Watchers themselves claim responsibility for. A third group, I said, the implications dawning on me. Someone else is accessing the cave system, outside your containment protocols. It's a working theory, Blackwood admitted. One that your email lends credence to. If you received that photograph from someone other than us, it suggests there's another player with detailed knowledge of both the cave system and our classification terminology. And they warned me that I'd been marked, I added. That the Watchers knew my scent. Dr. Voss frowned, which indicates they have insight into the Watchers' behavior patterns as well. This is concerning enough that I should be worried about more than just the Watchers if I leave here, I asked pointedly. We have no evidence that this third party, if they exist, presents a direct threat to you, Blackwood said. But as a precaution, we can offer you certain security measures if you agree to our terms. What kind of measures? Relocation assistance if you wish. A new position in a location of your choosing, with the transition funded by our organization. Periodic security checks to ensure you haven't been targeted. And a point of contact within the agency should you notice anything unusual. The offer was more generous than I'd expected, which only served to heighten my suspicion. You're that concerned about this potential third party? We're concerned about maintaining the stability of a delicate situation, Blackwood replied diplomatically. an arrangement that's kept the Watchers contained and cooperative for decades. Any disruption to that balance could have severe consequences. I considered the options before me. Cooperation seemed the only viable path forward, regardless of how distasteful I found the entire situation. "I'll agree to your terms, on one condition." "Which is?" Dr. Voss asked. "I want to know what happened to the spelunker who posted online about finding entrance FC7, the one who went by Deep Dweller. They disappeared after announcing a solo expedition to map one of the restricted sections." Blackwood's expression remained impassive, but I detected a slight tightening of his jaw. "That individual was indeed located and brought in, much as you were. And they now work for our organization," Dr. Voss said. "Their knowledge of the cave system proved valuable, so they were offered a position rather than simply being asked to maintain silence." "Can I speak with them?" I asked. "That won't be possible at this time," Blackwood replied. "They're currently deployed at another site." I had no way to verify their claim, but pursuing it seemed unlikely to yield results. "Fine. I'll delete my notes and photographs, leave the area, and keep quiet about what I've seen. In return, you provide the security measures you mentioned and leave me alone otherwise." "That's acceptable," Blackwood said, relief evident in his tone. "We'll need you to sign some non-disclosure agreements before you leave. But after that, you're free to go." Dr. Voss stood, gathering her materials. "I'll have the paperwork prepared. In the meantime, would you like to see more of our facility? It might help you understand the importance of the work we're doing here." I hesitated, then nodded. Despite everything, curiosity still burned within me. "I would, actually. I want to see these crystals you're so interested in." Blackwood seemed about to object, but Dr. Voss overrode him. "I think that's reasonable. A limited tour of the non-restricted areas. Follow me." She led me from the conference room into a corridor that sloped gently downward. I realized we were heading underground, beneath the surface facility I'd seen upon arrival. The architecture changed subtly, from the sterile white walls of the upper level to exposed rock face interspersed with reinforced concrete. The air grew cooler, carrying that familiar mineral scent of the cave system. "The facility is built directly over a sealed entrance to the cave network," Dr. Voss explained as we walked. "It allows controlled access to certain sections while maintaining security protocols." We passed several laboratories where technicians in white coats worked with equipment I didn't recognize. Through glass walls, I could see what appeared to be biological research in some rooms, materials testing in others. Dr. Voss pointed out particular projects as we passed, but the technical explanations meant little to me. Finally, we reached a secured door marked Crystalline Storage and Analysis. Dr. Voss swiped her badge and pressed her hand to a biometric scanner. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Beyond was a chamber unlike anything I'd seen before. The walls were lined with specialized storage units, each containing what appeared to be crystals of varying sizes and colors. But these were no ordinary mineral formations. They pulsed with a subtle, internal luminescence that shifted and flowed like liquid light. Even from a distance, I could feel something emanating from them. Not heat, not radiation, but some form of energy I had no context for understanding. "These are the primary focus of our research," Dr. Voss said, her voice taking on a reverent quality. "We call them bioluminescent neural crystals, though that's a simplification of their true nature. They appear to form at the intersection of the Watcher's biochemistry and a fungal network that exists only in the deepest sections of the cave system." I approached one of the storage units, drawn by the hypnotic pulsing of the crystal within. Up close, I could see intricate patterns within the structure, branching formations that resembled neural networks or mycelial growth. "What do they do?" I asked, unable to look away from the shifting patterns. "They conduct and amplify certain types of neural activity," Dr. Voss explained. "In their natural state, we believe they form a communication network throughout the cave system, allowing the Watchers to coordinate over vast distances. But when properly processed and integrated with our technology, they can do much more." She led me to another section of the room, where technicians were working with smaller crystal fragments embedded in what looked like circuit boards. "We've developed medical applications that accelerate nerve regeneration in injured tissue, communication systems that function in environments where radio waves can't penetrate, energy storage that exceeds any battery technology on the market." Her voice swelled with pride. "The potential applications are virtually limitless, and all of it dependent on maintaining your arrangement with the Watchers," I observed. "Precisely. They're the only ones who can safely harvest the crystals from their natural growth chambers. Attempts by our teams have resulted in unfortunate incidents. The fungal network reacts defensively to anyone not recognized as part of the Watcher community." I turned away from the display, suddenly overwhelmed by the implications. And the cost of all this technological advancement is turning a blind eye to what these creatures really are, what they've done. Dr. Voss's expression hardened slightly. "The Watchers were human once, yes, and they committed atrocities during their early years in the caves. But what they've become is something more complex than simply monsters. They've evolved to fill an ecological niche, developing a symbiotic relationship with the cave system itself. That doesn't justify. No, it doesn't justify their past actions, she interrupted. But it contextualizes our current approach. We contain them, prevent them from hunting humans, and in return gain access to resources that benefit millions through medical and technological applications. It's a compromise, but one with a net positive outcome. I had no response to that. The ethical calculus was too complex, the situation too far removed from normal human experience for me to judge confidently. And in the end, what choice did I have but to accept their terms? Dr. Voss seemed to sense my internal conflict. It's a lot to process, I know, but I hope you understand why secrecy is essential, and why we've gone to such lengths to manage this situation rather than simply eliminating the Watchers entirely. She escorted me back to the upper levels, where Blackwood was waiting with a stack of documents. The next hour was spent reviewing and signing non-disclosure agreements with severe penalties for breach. When it was done, Blackwood handed me a business card with a single phone number. If you notice anything unusual, particularly any sign you're being followed or observed after leaving the area, call this number immediately, he instructed. It's a direct line to our response team. And my car? I asked, being brought around now. Your belongings have been returned to it. He hesitated, then added, one piece of advice. Leave today. Don't spend another night in Cave City. The Watchers are more active after dark, and despite our agreements, individual sentinels have been known to operate independently at times. I nodded, tucking the card into my wallet. I wasn't planning to stay. They escorted me to the facility's entrance, where my car was indeed waiting, keys in the ignition. The rain had stopped, though the sky remained overcast. As I opened the driver's door, Dr. Voss approached with one final comment. The person who emailed you the photograph, they did you a favor, intentionally or not. The warning to leave while you still could was sound advice. Not everyone who's been marked has your opportunity for a clean departure. With that cryptic statement, she turned and walked back toward the building. Blackwood gave me a curt nod, then followed her. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled away from the facility. In my rearview mirror, I watched as the compound grew smaller, eventually disappearing around a bend in the road. The gate at the perimeter fence opened automatically as I approached, the guard simply watching as I passed through. Once on the main highway, I accelerated, heading directly for Interstate 65 north toward Louisville. I would follow Blackwood's advice and leave immediately, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Mammoth Cave before nightfall. As the miles accumulated, I tried to process everything I'd learned. The Watchers, evolved from human outcasts into something no longer entirely human, the government agency containing and cooperating with them in exchange for access to the strange crystals, the suggestion of a third party operating outside this arrangement, aware of both the Watchers and the government's involvement. It was a scenario so bizarre, so far removed from ordinary reality, that part of me still wondered if it could be some elaborate hoax or delusion. But the memory of that tall, robed figure in the forest, moving with its unnatural grace, the smell of decay emanating from the cave entrance, the chanting voices echoing from the darkness, those had been real, visceral experiences that couldn't be explained away. I don't know how much is real or how much is folklore that latches onto a place as mysterious as Mammoth Cave. All I can say is, I left Kentucky with a heavy feeling that I'd stumbled too close to a secret that's best left alone. Whether it's a genuine cannibal cult, some fringe group performing dark rituals, or something even stranger, a population of cave-dwelling not quite humans, studied and contained by a secret government agency, I can't shake the memory of those muffled voices echoing from the cave entrance, and the figure in the woods, whoever, or whatever they were, clearly didn't want company. I'm hoping maybe someone else has had a similar brush with the unknown in that region, or has heard rumors of some government involvement. If nothing else, maybe it'll serve as a warning. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, some secrets best left buried in the darkness beneath the earth. As I crossed the Kentucky state line into Indiana, a weight seemed to lift from my shoulders, but I knew it wasn't truly over. The memory would remain, along with the knowledge that beneath the tourist-friendly veneer of Mammoth Cave National Park, something ancient and hungry still dwelled in the unmapped passages, and now it knew my scent. I checked my rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see a black SUV following at a discreet distance. The road behind me was empty, but as I focused on the highway ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, not by Blackwood's agents or even by the Watchers themselves, but by whoever had sent that warning email. The third party, operating in the shadows between the government's containment protocols and the Watchers' subterranean domain. Who were they? What was their interest in me? And would they be satisfied that I had heeded their warning to leave while I still could? Questions without answers, mysteries better left unsolved. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing north, away from Cave City, away from Mammoth Cave, away from the forbidden holes and whatever watched from within their darkness. But deep down, I knew the truth. You can leave the caves behind, but once you've been marked, the darkness never truly leaves you. I never believed in monsters. Not the kind that lurk in shadows or haunt the edges of civilization. As a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest for 15 years, I'd encountered plenty of natural dangers. Aggressive bears, territorial moose, flash floods that appeared from nowhere. But nothing that couldn't be explained by science or animal behavior. At least, that's what I thought until last autumn, when everything I understood about our world changed forever. My name is unimportant. What matters is my story. One I've documented meticulously because I need others to know the truth about what dwells in America's wildest places. The forests hold secrets older than the nation itself. Whispers that echo from a time before European boots ever touched this soil. Blackwood spans over 400,000 acres of dense woodland, rugged mountains, and mist-shrouded valleys in the Pacific Northwest. My station sits on the eastern edge, where the ancient trees give way to rolling foothills. I patrol the boundaries where wilderness meets civilization, that delicate threshold where most incidents occur. Another missing hiker report, Diane sighed, sliding the paperwork across my desk that fateful September morning. The ranger station was quiet, sunlight streaming through dusty windows as autumn painted the forest outside in fiery hues. Third one this month, same area too. I studied the map coordinates. The disappearances clustered around Widow's Peak, a remote area locals had long avoided. Indigenous legends whispered about the region being a thin place, where the veil between worlds stretched gossamer thin. I dismissed such tales as colorful folklore designed to keep people away from dangerous terrain. Any connection between the missing? I asked, scanning the details. None that's obvious. Different ages, backgrounds. Only commonality is they were all solo hikers who ventured off trail. Rangers know the cardinal rule of wilderness safety: stay on marked paths. Those who wander invite trouble, typically from exposure, injury, or disorientation. But 3 disappearances in the same area within weeks was unusual. I'll check it out, I said, folding the map and tucking it into my jacket pocket. Weather's supposed to hold until tomorrow. I can make it to the northwestern quadrant by nightfall if I leave now. Diane's expression tightened. Be careful. Something about this feels different. If only I'd recognized her intuition for the warning it was. I packed light, sleeping bag, water purifier, first aid supplies, emergency rations, and my standard issue sidearm. Most rangers rarely draw their weapons, using them primarily for signaling or wildlife deterrence. I'd never fired mine outside of training. That too would change. The hike began pleasantly enough. September in Blackwood brings crisp air, dappled sunlight through changing leaves, and the earthy perfume of decaying vegetation, that sweet, musty scent marking nature's transition. I moved efficiently, following game trails and ranger shortcuts unknown to casual visitors. By mid-afternoon, the forest began to change. The friendly deciduous groves gave way to old-growth conifers, massive sentinels that blocked the sun, creating a perpetual twilight beneath their canopy. The temperature dropped noticeably. The pleasant forest sounds, birdsong, skittering squirrels, wind through leaves, gradually faded until only my footfalls broke the unnatural silence. I'd visited every corner of Blackwood in my years of service, yet something about this section felt foreign. The trees seemed to crowd closer, their bark blackened and twisted like arthritic fingers. Moss hung in long spectral curtains. The air turned heavy, carrying a metallic tang that coated my tongue. Near dusk, I reached a small clearing about 3 miles from the location of the last disappearance, perfect for setting up camp. As I unpacked my gear, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Rangers develop a sixth sense for wildlife observation. The weight of unseen eyes carries a distinctive feeling. But this was different, more focused, more intelligent. I built a small fire, its orange glow creating a fragile circle of warmth and light against the encroaching darkness. As night fell completely, the forest transformed. Shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. Wind whispered through the trees with almost vocal cadence, rising and falling like conversation just below the threshold of comprehension. In my sleeping bag, I stared upward at stars peeking through the forest canopy. The constellations looked wrong somehow, the familiar patterns slightly altered, as if I were viewing them from a different planet. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of being pursued through endless trees by something I couldn't see but sensed at every turn. A sound woke me near midnight, a cracking branch that my subconscious recognized as too deliberate, too heavy for normal forest wildlife. My hand moved instinctively to the flashlight beside me. The fire had burned to embers, casting only the faintest red glow across the clearing's edge. I scanned the darkness, the beam of light catching nothing but trees and undergrowth. Then, just as I prepared to dismiss it as ordinary forest sounds, my light passed over something that didn't belong. A flash of movement at the tree line. Not furtive like an animal, but deliberate. Something watching, assessing, considering. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting drawing attention to myself. "Park ranger, identify yourself." Only silence answered. Yet the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating what would happen next. The light caught it again. Movement between two massive pines. A figure, unnaturally tall and thin, slipped between the trees with impossible grace. It moved like smoke, fluid yet substantial. I caught only a glimpse before it vanished, but it was enough to send ice through my veins. No human moved like that. No animal either. I remained awake until dawn. The fire built high, my sidearm within easy reach. When first light finally broke through the trees, I felt foolish. Darkness plays tricks on the mind. Every experienced ranger knows this. I packed my gear quickly, eager to continue the search for the missing hikers in daylight's rational embrace. But as I shouldered my pack, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Circling my campsite, pressed into the soft forest loam, were footprints. Human in shape but wrong in proportion, too narrow and deep, with elongated toes that dug into the earth like claws. They formed a perfect circle around where I'd slept, as if something had paced the perimeter all night. Watching, waiting. I'd seen prints from every creature native to these woods. These belonged to none of them. That was my first indication that the old stories might contain more truth than I'd ever allowed myself to believe. Something hunted in Blackwood Forest. Something the missing hikers had encountered before me. And now it had found me too. The footprints haunted me as I continued toward Widow's Peak. Each step through the increasingly dense forest felt like walking deeper into another world. One where natural laws bent and twisted like the gnarled trees surrounding me. By mid-morning, I reached the coordinates of the most recent disappearance. A 26-year-old wildlife photographer named Marcus Chen had vanished 3 days prior. His last communication had been a text message to his sister. "Found something incredible. Going off trail to get closer. We'll send pics." No photos ever arrived. His backpack was discovered by a search party the following day. Camera missing, supplies untouched. The official search had been called off after 48 hours. Standard procedure when resources are limited and survival chances diminish. But I wasn't ready to abandon another soul to the forest. Not with what I'd seen last night. I studied the area meticulously, looking for signs others might have missed. Experience had taught me that missing persons cases often hinged on subtle details. A broken twig, disturbed moss, fabric caught on brambles. Hours passed with nothing unusual until I noticed an odd configuration of stones near a massive fallen cedar. 7 rocks arranged in a rough circle, with an 8th in the center. The formation was too deliberate to be natural, yet didn't match any trail marking system used by rangers or hikers. Curious, I approached and knelt beside the arrangement. The center stone was different from the others. Smooth black basalt that felt unnaturally cold to the touch despite the warm afternoon sun. When I lifted it, my blood froze. Beneath lay a small carved figurine no larger than my thumb. It depicted a humanoid form with unnaturally elongated limbs and a featureless face save for deeply carved eyes. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each sinew and joint rendered with anatomical precision. But the material, I couldn't identify it. Not wood, not stone, not bone, though it resembled all three. As I examined the figurine, a sound pierced the forest silence. A high, keening whistle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Birds erupted from the canopy in panicked flight. The whistle modulated into something that chilled me more deeply. It began to sound like words, spoken in no language I recognized yet somehow carrying meaning. I pocketed the figurine, a decision I would later question, and headed in the direction of the strange sound. The forest grew darker as I walked, though my watch showed only early afternoon. The trees closed ranks, branches intertwining overhead to block the sky. Mist rose from the ground in twisting columns. After 20 minutes of hiking through increasingly bizarre terrain, I emerged onto the banks of a narrow stream I didn't recognize from any forest survey map. The water ran clear but moved wrong, flowing too slowly, almost viscous, like liquid glass. On the opposite bank stood a crude shelter fashioned from branches and animal hides. A campsite, but unlike any I'd seen before. No modern equipment, no synthetic materials, just primitive construction that belonged to a different century. "Hello," I called, hand resting cautiously on my sidearm. "National Park Service." Movement flickered inside the shelter. I waded across the strange stream, uniform pants soaking through with water that felt oddly warm against my skin. As I approached the shelter, overwhelming dread washed over me, that primal fear humans carried before civilization, the instinctive recognition of something wrongly shaped. I drew my weapon. Regulation be damned. Identify yourself, I commanded, using my authoritative ranger voice that usually commanded respect even from the most belligerent visitors. A figure emerged from the shelter, and my understanding of reality permanently fractured. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, with limbs jointed in too many places. Its skin was the color of wet ash, stretched taut over a frame that resembled a human's, but with proportions all wrong. The face, I still struggled to describe it coherently. Features that shifted and rearranged themselves as if unable to settle on a final form. Only the eyes remained constant, large, black, and possessing an intelligence that felt ancient and predatory. My weapon raised instinctively, though some part of me recognized bullets might be useless against whatever this was. The creature cocked its head at an impossible angle, regarding me with detached curiosity. Then it spoke, not with its mouth, did it even have one, but directly into my mind. Watcher of woods, protector of boundaries, you seek the lost ones. Not a question, a statement of fact. Its mental voice felt like ice water trickling down my spine. What are you? I managed to ask, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I am many names throughout time. Your kind once called us skin dancers, forest walkers, those who wait in shadow, skinwalker. The term floated up from Navajo legends I'd studied during ranger training, but this didn't match any description I'd read. Did you take the missing hikers? I demanded, weapon still raised. The creature's form rippled, features rearranging themselves into something approximating amusement. Take implies ownership. We do not own. We invite. They accepted. Where are they? Walking other paths. Seeing with new eyes. The boundaries weaken. The old ways return. Soon many will cross. It gestured toward the figurine bulging in my pocket. You carry my shadow form. A connection established. The invitation extended. Cold realization dawned. The stone arrangement, the figurine, a trap. Not for human prey, but for human attention. My attention. The creature took a step forward. I fired a warning shot into the ground between us. The report echoed strangely, muffled as if the air itself absorbed the sound. It paused, those black eyes narrowing. Violence is unnecessary, watcher of woods. You will understand soon enough. The changing time approaches. The veil thins. I want to see the missing people, I insisted. Now, they walk the shadow paths willingly. But you... Its gaze intensified, boring into my mind. You are different. A guardian of the threshold. You could be more. The creature extended one impossibly long arm, fingers unfurling like pale spiders. Come, see what they have seen. Every rational instinct screamed to retreat. But something deeper, that primal curiosity that has driven human evolution and exploration, held me in place. If I fled, I might never find the missing hikers. If I stayed, before I could decide, the forest erupted with sound, crashing undergrowth, voices calling my name. The search party I'd radioed before leaving the station had finally arrived. The creature's form seemed to blur around the edges, dissolving into the forest shadows. Others approach. Our time ends. But I have tasted your mind now, watcher of woods. You will seek answers, and when you do, you will find me waiting. It retreated into the shelter, which collapsed inward impossibly, leaving nothing but a scatter of normal-looking branches and leaves. By the time my colleagues burst into the clearing, I stood alone on the bank of an ordinary forest stream, the primitive shelter nowhere to be seen. You okay? Diane asked, reaching me first. You look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, I thought. Something far older. The figurine in my pocket burned cold against my thigh. A talisman, a warning, an invitation. I said nothing about it or the creature to my colleagues. How could I? There was no protocol for encounters with beings that shouldn't exist. As we hiked back to base, I glanced repeatedly over my shoulder, the weight of unseen eyes following our progress through the darkening forest. The missing hikers remained missing. The official report would cite animal attack or exposure as the probable cause. Only I knew different. Only I had met what really hunted in Blackwood's ancient heart, and only I carried a piece of it back to civilization. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shifting features, those ancient black eyes examining me with cold curiosity. The figurine sat on my bedside table, impossible to ignore yet equally impossible to explain. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed information, context for what I'd experienced. If creatures from folklore walked the modern world, There had to be documentation, historical accounts, patterns I could analyze. I called in sick for the first time in 5 years. Diane's voice conveyed skepticism, but she didn't press. "You did look pretty rough yesterday," she admitted. "Take the time you need." My first stop was the County Historical Society, a quaint building housing archives of local history dating back to the first European settlements. The elderly curator raised an eyebrow at my request for information on local folklore, particularly stories about forest entities. "Academic interest," I explained lamely, unwilling to share my true motives. She disappeared into the archives, returning with several dust-covered boxes. "Most researchers focus on documented history," she said, "but I've always found the stories people tell equally revealing." The materials provided a foundation. Newspaper clippings of unexplained disappearances dating back to the 1880s, journal entries from trappers and hunters describing encounters with shadow people or watchers, and transcriptions of oral histories from local indigenous tribes warning of thin places in the forest where other worlds pressed against our own. Most accounts shared common elements: encounters in remote areas, particularly around Widow's Peak, strange stone arrangements, the feeling of being observed, and missing persons who were either never found or discovered in inexplicable circumstances, alive but changed, unable or unwilling to explain their experiences. One journal entry from 1923 particularly chilled me. The creature spoke without speaking, offering knowledge beyond human understanding. Thomas accepted and vanished before my eyes, stepping into the air as if through an invisible door. 3 days later, they found him sitting on his own porch, though search parties had checked there repeatedly. He would not speak of where he'd been, but his eyes held something ancient. Within a month, he walked into the forest and was never seen again. The pattern was becoming clear, but I needed more current information. After the Historical Society, I visited the public library, using their computers to search online forums where people shared unexplained experiences. I found hundreds of accounts from across North America describing entities that matched what I'd seen: unnaturally tall, wrong proportions, shifting features, telepathic communication. Most witnesses were dismissed as hoaxers or mentally unstable. Others disappeared shortly after posting their stories. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the broader implications. This wasn't isolated to Blackwood. These entities existed throughout the wilderness areas of North America, perhaps beyond. By afternoon, I'd compiled enough research to fill a notebook with relevant information, but academic knowledge felt insufficient. I needed practical insights from someone who understood the phenomenon firsthand. That led me to Eleanor Wright, a local woman in her 80s who, according to Historical Society records, had been the sole survivor of a famous incident in 1956 when 4 hikers vanished near Widow's Peak. Newspaper accounts described her as confused and delirious when Forest Service personnel found her 3 days after the group was reported missing. I located her address through public records and drove to a modest house on the outskirts of town. The property bordered the forest, separated only by a low stone wall covered in strange symbols I recognized from my research. Wards, according to folklore, against unwelcome visitors. Eleanor opened the door before I could knock. Tiny and bird-like, with sharp eyes that evaluated me thoroughly. She showed no surprise at my uniform. "You've seen them," she stated flatly. "That's why you're here." I nodded, unable to form a denial. "Come in then, but leave that thing on the porch." She pointed to my pocket where the figurine rested. I placed it on the railing, disturbed by the relief I felt once it was no longer touching me. Inside, her home was cluttered with books on folklore, anthropology, and comparative religion. Sketches covered one wall, all depicting variations of the entity I'd encountered, labeled with dates and locations spanning decades. "Sit," she commanded, pouring tea without asking if I wanted any. "You have questions. I have some answers, though probably not the ones you want." "What are they?" I began with the most fundamental query. "Older than us," she replied. "Much older. They were here before humans recognized themselves as separate from nature. Some cultures called them gods, others demons. Some indigenous peoples understood them better, as guardians of boundaries between worlds." "Are they dangerous?" Her laugh held no humor. "Define dangerous. A mountain lion is dangerous. A storm is dangerous. These beings are different. They operate by rules we barely comprehend. They don't think like us, don't want like us." "They've been taking people," I said. "Taking implies force," she countered, echoing the creature's words. "They invite. They offer knowledge, experiences beyond human understanding. Some accept, like your friends in 1956. Pain flashed across her face. "My husband. My brother. 2 friends. Yes, they accepted." I hesitated. "That's why I'm still here." "What happened to them?" "They stepped through," she said simply. There are doorways in thin places, where our world and theirs overlap. Those who cross can sometimes return, but they're changed. They've seen too much to live comfortably in our limited reality. I described my encounter, watching her nod in recognition. "You've been marked," she said, gesturing toward the porch where the figurine lay. "A connection established. It will call to you, try to draw you back." "How do I stop it?" Her expression turned pitying. "You don't. Not completely. You can resist, set boundaries. The symbols on my wall help. But once they know you, they never fully leave you alone. And the missing hikers? Some may return, changed but alive. Others will remain there, learning what they sought to know. These entities aren't evil by our definition. They simply exist according to different natural laws." "How do you live with it?" I asked. "Knowing what's out there, what happened to your loved ones." She gazed out the window toward the forest edge. "I maintain the balance. I remember. I warn those who might listen." Her eyes returned to mine. "Like I'm warning you now. Don't go looking for them again. They're already watching you more closely than you realize." As if on cue, a shadow passed across the window, too tall, too thin to be human. Eleanor didn't react, as if such visitations were commonplace. "They're growing bolder," she observed. "The boundaries weaken. Climate change, destruction of ancient forests, human encroachment, all thinning the veil between worlds. What was once rare becomes common." Before leaving, I asked one final question. "Is there any way to help those who've been taken?" Her answer haunts me still. "Help implies they need rescuing. Are you certain they do? Perhaps they found exactly what they were seeking." I left Eleanor's house with more questions than answers, but with something equally valuable: confirmation I wasn't losing my mind. The phenomenon was real, documented across centuries, consistent in its manifestations. As I retrieved the figurine from the porch, Eleanor called after me, "Remember, Ranger, curiosity is how they hook you. The desire to know, to experience, to transcend ordinary perception. That's the true invitation." Driving home through deepening twilight, I passed the forest edge where shadows gathered like conspirators. For an instant in my headlights, I glimpsed a familiar tall figure watching from between the trees, black eyes reflecting light like a predator's. The figurine on the passenger seat seemed to pulse with cold energy. I realized I faced a choice that would define everything that followed: continue investigating, potentially endangering myself, or retreat to the comfortable ignorance of conventional reality. As a park ranger, my duty was to protect visitors from wilderness dangers. But how could I protect them from dangers I barely understood? Sleep eluded me again that night. In dreams that weren't quite dreams, I heard the creature's voice calling me back to the forest. The invitation remained open. The choice was mine. 5 days passed in uneasy limbo. I returned to work, patrolling the safer sections of Blackwood, filing reports, and pretending my world hadn't fundamentally changed. The figurine remained hidden in my desk drawer, yet I constantly felt its presence, a cold pulse that grew stronger whenever I considered returning to Widow's Peak. Then came the call that forced my hand. "Another disappearance," Diane announced, expression grim. "But different this time." My stomach tightened. "Different how?" "It's one of ours. Jake Matheson. Went out on routine patrol yesterday and never checked in. His last radio transmission came from Widow's Peak," I finished, already knowing the answer. She nodded. "Search parties assembling now. I told them to wait for you. You know that area better than anyone." Jake was 24, a promising ranger who'd joined our team just 18 months earlier. Enthusiastic, meticulous, with a deep respect for the wilderness, exactly the kind of person we needed in the service. Also exactly the kind of person who would follow strange sounds or unusual phenomena, driven by curiosity and duty. I knew then that avoidance was no longer an option. My knowledge made me responsible. Within an hour, our search team, myself, Diane, and 2 seasonal rangers deployed to Jake's last known coordinates. I brought the figurine, sensing it might prove useful, though I couldn't articulate why. The forest welcomed us with unusual warmth for early October, a heavy, oppressive heat that contradicted the weather report. Mist clung to the ground despite the temperature, swirling around our boots as we hiked deeper into the old-growth section. "Something feels off," Diane muttered as we approached Widow's Peak. The animals. She was right. The forest had fallen silent again. No bird song, no insects buzzing, not even wind through the canopy. Just the sound of our breathing and footfalls on soft earth. We found Jake's backpack at the base of an ancient hemlock, equipment untouched, radio still functional. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. Just like the others. "We'll establish a search grid," I announced, taking charge. "Teams of 2, regular radio check-ins every 15 minutes. Diane, you're with me." As the other rangers moved off to begin their search pattern, I led Diane toward the stream where I'd encountered the entity. Something told me Jake had been drawn to the same location. "You know something," Diane said after several minutes of silent hiking. Not a question. I hesitated, weighing professional credibility against the need for truth. "I have a theory," I admitted finally, "based on previous observations." "Cut the bureaucratic language," she countered. "We've worked together 15 years. Something happened when you came out here last time." The relief of unburdening myself was tempered by the certainty she wouldn't believe me. Nevertheless, I told her everything. The entity, Eleanor Wright, the historical pattern of disappearances. To my surprise, Diane didn't dismiss my account. Her expression remained thoughtful, calculating. "My grandmother was Blackfoot," she said after I finished. "She had stories about thin places, entities that could move between worlds." A pause. "I always thought they were just stories." "They're not," I said simply. We reached the stream as afternoon light filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows across the water. It looked ordinary today. No viscous flow, no unnatural qualities. Yet the atmosphere remained charged, expectant. "There," Diane pointed to the opposite bank. "Footprints, regulation issue ranger boots, Jake's size." They led toward a dense thicket of rhododendron and disappeared. As we crossed the stream, the figurine in my pocket grew painfully cold. I removed it, surprised to find it vibrating slightly against my palm. "What is that?" Diane asked, eyeing it warily. "A connection," I replied, remembering Eleanor's words. "And maybe our way to find Jake." The figurine seemed to pull toward the thicket, like a compass needle seeking north. Following its guidance, we pushed through the dense vegetation into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. A perfect circle of bare earth, surrounded by impossibly tall trees that I didn't recognize from any botanical catalog. In the center stood Jake Matheson, alive but changed. He stood unnaturally still, head tilted at a painful angle, eyes fixed on something invisible in the middle distance. Beside him waited the entity, its form even more disturbing in daylight, features constantly rearranging themselves like smoke, given temporary solidity. "Jake?" Diane called, stepping forward. He didn't respond, didn't even blink. The entity, however, turned its attention toward us. "The Watcher of Woods returns." Its voice filled my head. "And brings another." The circle widens. "Let him go," I demanded, drawing my sidearm despite knowing its probable uselessness. "He does not wish to leave," the entity replied. "He learns. He sees beyond the veil, as many have before." "What are you showing him?" I asked, inching closer. "Realities. Possibilities. Truths your kind once knew but forgot in your rush to separate from nature." Diane had drawn her weapon too, though her hand shook slightly. "Can you hear it?" she whispered. I nodded. "It communicates telepathically." The entity gestured toward Jake with one elongated limb. "He stands at the threshold, not yet committed to crossing. You may still call him back, if he chooses to listen." "Jake!" I shouted. "Ranger Matheson, you need to come back with us." His eyes remained unfocused, but something flickered across his expression. Recognition. Conflict. The entity addressed me again. "You carry my shadow form. The invitation remains open to you as well. Do you not wish to understand? To see beyond human limitations?" The figurine pulsed warmly now, almost seductively. I could feel its pull, the temptation to know, to experience what lay beyond ordinary perception. For a moment I glimpsed what Jake must be seeing. Realities layered upon realities, time flowing in multiple directions simultaneously, consciousness extending beyond individual boundaries into a vast, interconnected web. "No," I said firmly, though part of me wavered. "I'm here for Jake, that's all." Duty over curiosity. Admirable, if limited. The entity's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "What will you offer in exchange for this one's return?" "What do you want?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Recognition. Remembrance. Your kind once acknowledged us, respected the boundaries. Now you forget, dismiss, rationalize. The old compacts weaken. Understanding dawns slowly. These entities weren't predators in the conventional sense. They were guardians of something older than human civilization. Forces of nature personified. They didn't seek worship or sacrifice, but acknowledgement of their reality. If I promise to remember, to respect the boundaries, will you release him?" The entity considered, its form shifting more rapidly. "Words are insufficient. A token is required. An exchange." I understood immediately. The figurine for Jake, yes. "Return my shadow form, and this one may choose to follow you back." "How do I know you'll keep your word?" I demanded. "Concepts of deception are human constructs. We simply are what we are. We do what is in our nature." It wasn't much of a guarantee, but I had few alternatives. I placed the figurine on the ground between us. Instantly it began to change, the material softening, flowing, until it resembled a small pool of midnight that absorbed into the earth. The entity inclined its head in what might have been satisfaction. The compact is made. Call to him now. If his connection to your reality remains strong enough, he will hear. Jake, I said, keeping my voice calm and authoritative. It's time to come home. Your family is waiting. Your fellow rangers need you. For several agonizing moments, nothing happened. Jake remained frozen, caught between worlds. Then, slowly, his eyes focused, awareness returning like dawn breaking. Chief? He whispered, voice rusty from disuse. What? Where am I? You're in the forest, I replied, relief flooding through me. You've been missing for 24 hours. He looked disoriented, gaze darting between us and the entity beside him. It showed me things. So many things. I know, I said gently. But it's time to come back now. Jake took one faltering step toward us, then another. The entity made no move to stop him, watching with those unfathomable black eyes. As Jake reached us, Diane grabbed his arm, anchoring him to human contact. We've got you, she assured him. I addressed the entity one final time. Our bargain is complete. We'll leave your territory now. The boundary is re-established, Watcher of Woods. But thinning continues. Others will come. Others will cross. I'll remember, I promised, and I'll warn those who will listen. The entity's form began to dissolve into the forest shadows. Until the next thinning time then, we will be watching, always watching. As we led Jake from the clearing, supporting his unsteady steps, I felt something fundamental shift within the forest. Not a physical change, but an alteration in the underlying reality. The trees seemed to exhale, tension dispersing. Birdsong gradually returned. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. Jake would require careful monitoring. His experience had changed him. That much was evident from his distant gaze and fragmented speech. But he was alive, and he was coming home. Diane caught my eye over Jake's bowed head. This isn't over, is it? No, I admitted. I think it's just beginning. The sun was setting as we rejoined the other search team members, bathing Blackwood Forest in golden light that rendered even the darkest shadows temporarily benign. But as I glanced back toward Widow's Peak, I knew the ancient watchers remained, patient, eternal, existing alongside our world while occupying a reality I could barely comprehend. I had fulfilled my duty as a ranger today, but I had also accepted a new responsibility, to remember, to witness, to maintain the delicate balance between worlds that grew increasingly fragile with each passing year. 3 months passed. Winter descended on Blackwood Forest, transforming the landscape with snow and ice. Jake Matheson took extended medical leave, spending time with family while receiving therapy for what official reports labeled trauma-induced dissociative episodes. Only a handful of us knew the truth. I continued my regular duties, but with heightened awareness of the forest's deeper mysteries. Small things caught my attention now. Stone arrangements left by unknown hands, whispers in the wind that almost formed words, shadows that moved independently of their sources. The entities remained mostly hidden, but I sensed their presence constantly, especially near the boundaries of Widow's Peak. Eleanor Wright became an unexpected mentor. Weekly visits to her home provided context for my experiences and practical knowledge about maintaining boundaries without severing connections entirely. You've become a guardian, she told me during one snowy evening, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Not just of the forest, but of the threshold between worlds. I never asked for that responsibility, I countered. Few who serve as intermediaries do, she replied. The role finds those suited to it. December brought administrative changes that complicated my situation. Budget cuts forced Blackwood to reduce winter patrols, particularly in remote areas deemed low visitation risk during cold months. Widow's Peak fell into this category despite my carefully worded objections. We can't justify resource allocation based on folklore, my supervisor stated firmly after rejecting my patrol schedule recommendations. Focus on areas with documented safety concerns. I could hardly explain that the documented safety concerns were being systematically misclassified. Missing persons continued to be attributed to exposure, animal attacks, or hikers simply becoming lost. Rational explanations that maintained the comfortable fiction of a world without mysteries. 2 weeks before Christmas, heavy snowfall isolated the eastern section of the park. Most staff took holiday leave, leaving a skeleton crew to handle emergencies. I volunteered for the Christmas Eve shift, knowing the forest would be empty of visitors and allowing others to spend time with family. The ranger station felt cavernous and still as evening approached. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains, accumulating rapidly. I brewed coffee, completed paperwork, and Waited for my shift to end with no expectation of incident. The radio crackled to life at 11:17 p.m. Help. Anyone. Coordinates. The transmission broke apart, static overwhelming the words before cutting out completely. I tried to re-establish contact, following standard protocol. No response. The brief transmission contained too little information to determine location or nature of emergency. Under normal circumstances, I would deploy search and rescue immediately, but something felt wrong. Christmas Eve, in a blizzard, with trails closed and warnings posted throughout the park. No ordinary visitor would be out there. And the voice, there was something familiar about it. Something that resonated with memories of that day at Widow's Peak. I cross-referenced the partial transmission with our communication system. The signal had originated from the northwestern quadrant, Widow's Peak, exactly where I'd expected. Protocol dictated calling for backup before investigating a distress call in dangerous conditions. But backup would take hours to assemble in the storm, and something told me this wasn't an ordinary emergency. This was a message meant specifically for me. I geared up for winter conditions. Thermal layers, emergency supplies, heavy-duty flashlight, GPS, and sidearm. As I prepared to leave, I hesitated before the supply cabinet, then retrieved an item I'd started carrying on all patrols, a small pouch containing symbols Eleanor had taught me, protection against unwanted influence, carved into stone tokens. The drive to the nearest accessible trailhead took 40 minutes through near whiteout conditions. Hiking to Widow's Peak would normally require several hours, but with deep snow and limited visibility, I estimated double that time. If someone truly needed rescue, they might not survive that long in these temperatures. Yet something told me this wasn't about a human emergency at all. The forest in winter storm presented an entirely different set of dangers. Hypothermia, disorientation, snow-laden branches crashing down, wildlife driven to desperation by hunger. I moved carefully, following landmarks I'd memorized rather than snow-covered trails. 2 hours into the hike, the storm abruptly ceased. Snow hung suspended in the air as if time itself had paused. The silence was absolute, not even the crunch of snow beneath my boots made sound. The forest had entered that unnatural state I now recognized as a boundary thinning. I continued forward, no longer needing my flashlight. The snow glowed with its own pale luminescence, casting the forest in monochromatic blue light. My breath formed no vapor despite the cold. Reality was altering around me, rules changing subtly with each step toward Widow's Peak. The frozen stream appeared exactly where I expected, though its surface now resembled polished obsidian rather than ice. Across it stood the entity, or perhaps a different one, identical in its otherworldliness, watching my approach with familiar black eyes. Watcher of Woods. Its voice filled my mind. You answered the calling. Was that you on the radio? I asked, stopping at the stream's edge. We use what methods reach you. The threshold weakens tonight, when your world celebrates ancient rituals of light amid darkness. I recognized the reference to Christmas Eve, winter solstice, and similar celebrations marking the year's darkest time. Periods when, according to folklore, boundaries between worlds grew most permeable. Why call me here? I demanded. What's happening? The entity's form rippled, features rearranging into a configuration that somehow conveyed urgency. Others come, others without understanding. They tear at boundaries with intent, not accident. Other humans, you mean? Seekers of power. They learn fragments of old ways but lack respect for balance. They breach what should not be breached. Cold understanding dawned. Someone's trying to force a crossing to your world. Force unnatural passages. Draw entities not meant for your reality. The consequences spread beyond both our kinds. I hadn't considered that these boundary entities might themselves be maintaining order, preventing more dangerous forces from entering our world. The revelation shifted my perspective on their role. Where? I asked. Where are they doing this? The ancient circle. The place of standing stones. You know it. I did. A formation of megalithic rocks deep in Blackwood's heart, officially classified as indigenous ceremonial grounds dating back centuries. Archaeologists had documented the site but found little to explain its purpose or significance. What do you need from me? The question felt strange, offering assistance to an entity I barely understood, whose nature remained fundamentally alien. Human rituals require human intervention. We cannot directly stop what they begin. And if I help, balance returns. Boundaries stabilize. The compact between our kinds renews. I considered my options. Refusing meant potentially allowing unknown dangers to enter our world. Helping meant acknowledging these entities as legitimate guardians of natural order. A profound philosophical shift from seeing them as threats or anomalies. I'll need to see what they're doing first, I said cautiously. I won't commit to interference without understanding the situation. Acceptable. Follow. The entity moved along the frozen stream, its form sometimes solid, sometimes dissolving into mist before reforming. I followed at a distance, alert for any sign of deception or threat. We traveled what should have been miles in minutes, space compressing around us as we moved through the forest. The standing stones appeared suddenly, a circle of 12 megalithic slabs surrounding a central altar stone, all dusted with fresh snow except the altar itself, which remained mysteriously bare. Around the circle stood 4 figures in dark clothing, hoods obscuring their faces. They had cleared the snow within the stone circle and marked the ground with symbols I recognized from my research. Invocation glyphs, boundary-breaking sigils, doorway markers. A 5th figure lay on the altar stone, apparently unconscious. They require 5 crossings to create a permanent breach, the entity explained. 4 willing, 1 sacrifice. Horror rose within me. They're going to kill that person? Death bridges realms when properly channeled. They know ancient methods, forgotten by most of your kind. I drew my sidearm, though I had no clear shot from this distance. I need to stop them now. Caution, Watcher of Woods. The ritual has begun. Interruption without proper countermeasures risks greater damage. What countermeasures? Tell me quickly. The entity gestured toward my pocket. The symbols you carry. Place 1 at each cardinal direction outside their circle. Then disrupt their center focus. I retrieved Eleanor's stone tokens, each carved with protective symbols. The entities couldn't directly interfere, but they could guide human actions to maintain natural order. I was being used as their instrument, but for purposes that aligned with my own duty to protect. Moving silently through the snow, I circled wide around the ritual site. The hooded figures chanted in a language I didn't recognize, their voices creating discordant harmonies that hurt my ears. The air above the altar stone had begun to shimmer and darken, forming what appeared to be a growing rent in reality itself. I placed the first token at the northernmost point outside their circle, burying it in snow. Immediately, I felt the forest respond. A subtle shift in pressure, a momentary clarification of sound. The chanting faltered briefly before resuming. Working my way clockwise, I positioned the remaining tokens at east, south, and west points. With each placement, the unnatural tear above the altar seemed to stabilize, no longer growing though still present. The central focus. What did the entity mean? The unconscious person on the altar stone, I realized. They were channeling the ritual through a human conduit. I had seconds to act before the hooded figures noticed the change in their ritual's progression. Drawing my sidearm, I shouted with all the authoritative force I could muster. National Park Service, step away from the altar immediately. The figures turned in unified shock, chanting interrupted. I fired a single shot into the air, the report echoing strangely through the altered atmosphere. 2 of the hooded individuals fled immediately into the forest. Another reached inside their robe, possibly for a weapon. I aimed directly at them. Don't, I warned. Hands where I can see them. The 4th figure, apparently the leader, turned toward the tear in reality. It's too late. The door opens. They were right. Despite the interruption and the protective tokens, the tear had begun to widen again. Something moved within it, a darkness deeper than absence of light. A presence that radiated malevolence unlike anything I'd encountered before. The unconscious victim on the altar stone began to convulse, back arching impossibly as dark energy poured into them from the widening rent. I made a split-second decision and rushed forward, tackling the leader away from the altar. We crashed to the ground as the remaining hooded figure fled into the darkness. You fool, the leader hissed, face revealed as that of a middle-aged man with wild eyes. Do you know what power we could command? What knowledge could be ours? I know you're willing to murder for it, I snarled, securing his wrists with zip ties from my gear. That tells me everything I need to know about your intentions. With the leader restrained, I turned my attention to the victim and the still widening tear. The entity materialized beside me, its form more distinct than I'd ever seen it, features almost solidified into something resembling ancient indigenous depictions of forest spirits. The breach must be sealed, the channeling body removed. I lifted the unconscious victim, a young woman, barely 20, from the altar stone. Immediately, the tear's expansion halted, its edges fluctuating uncertainly. Not enough, the entity communicated urgently. The opening requires closing ritual. Tell me what to do, I demanded, feeling reality itself becoming increasingly unstable around us. Place your hands upon the altar. Allow me temporary connection through your consciousness. Everything in my training and experience warned against such vulnerability. Yet the alternative seemed far worse, allowing whatever darkness gathered beyond that tier to enter our world. I gently placed the young woman in the snow beside my restrained prisoner, then approached the altar stone. It hummed with energy, vibrating at a frequency that made my teeth ache and vision blur. Will I remain? Me? I asked, hands hovering above the stone. You will be changed by knowing, as all are, but yourself remains your own. Taking a deep breath, I pressed my palms against the cold, smooth surface of the altar. The entity moved behind me, its form enveloping mine like mist. For a terrifying moment, I felt my consciousness expanding beyond physical boundaries, perception stretching to encompass multiple overlapping realities simultaneously. Through the entity's awareness, I glimpsed what lay beyond the tier. Ancient forces neither good nor evil, but utterly alien to human understanding. Entities that existed in dimensions where physical laws operated differently. My voice spoke words I didn't understand, language flowing through me rather than from me. My hands traced symbols on the altar stone that disappeared into its surface like ripples in water. The tier began to contract, edges pulling inward despite resistance from whatever waited beyond. The process felt simultaneously instantaneous and eternal. When it finally completed, the tear sealed with an audible snap that echoed through the forest. Normal reality crashed back into place. Snow falling again, wind resuming its mournful howl through bare branches, sensory input limited once more to ordinary human perception. I staggered away from the altar, physically and mentally exhausted. The entity stood opposite me, its form already beginning to fade. The balance returns. The boundary strengthens. You have chosen your role, Watcher of Woods. Did I have a choice? I asked, still reeling from the experience. All have choice. You chose protection over power. Knowledge with respect rather than domination. The old way. The entity gestured toward my prisoners, the cult leader and the unconscious victim. These require your human justice now. Our concerns end where yours begin. Will they try again? Others like them, always. The lure of transcendence calls to your kind as strongly as it ever did. Some seek it with wisdom, others with greed. The boundary requires guardians on both sides. I understood then that my role had fundamentally changed. No longer just a park ranger protecting wilderness from human impact, but a guardian of boundaries between realities. A role humans had played for millennia through shamans, mystics, and those sensitive to the world's deeper mysteries. I'll need help, I admitted. Knowledge. Training. The old woman guides you well. Others exist. You will find them as needed. The entity began dissolving into the snowy air, its parting thought lingering in my mind. Until next thinning time, Guardian. Watch the boundaries. Remember the compact. We do the same. I was left alone in the ancient stone circle with my two human concerns, a criminal to bring to justice and a victim to return to safety. Ordinary ranger duties, though the context had expanded beyond anything my training had prepared me for. By dawn, I had hiked back to my vehicle with both individuals. The young woman now conscious but disoriented, the cult leader sullenly silent. I reported finding them performing dangerous rituals in the park after responding to an emergency call. The official report mentioned nothing of entities, reality tears, or boundary guardianship. Some truths remain unwritten, passed only to those prepared to understand them. In the months that followed, I continued my ranger duties with renewed purpose. Eleanor Wright began introducing me to others who served as boundary keepers in various capacities, a network of ordinary people with extraordinary awareness, scattered throughout the country in places where the veil between worlds grew thin. Jake Matheson eventually returned to service, changed but functioning. We never discussed his experience directly, but sometimes I would catch him staring into the forest with knowing eyes, listening to voices others couldn't hear. The entities remain present in Blackwood's deepest reaches. I sense them watching whenever I patrol near Widow's Peak. Not with malice, but with ancient, patient awareness. We have an understanding now, mutual recognition of roles in maintaining natural order that extends beyond conventional human knowledge. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the forest speaks in whispers and shadows move with purpose, I remember that glimpse beyond ordinary reality, the vast interconnected web of consciousness that spans dimensions and binds all living things. The experience changed me, as the entity predicted. Not in any obvious way visible to colleagues or friends, but in my fundamental understanding of humanity's place in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than most ever realize. I remain a watcher of woods, a guardian of boundaries, a keeper of secrets older than human civilization. One among many who stand at the threshold between worlds, maintaining the delicate balance that allows both to coexist. And when visitors ask if I believe in ghosts or monsters while gathering around campfires, I smile and tell them the forest contains mysteries worth respecting. Some understand the deeper meaning, others dismiss it as ranger superstition. Both responses serve the balance in their way. After all, some are meant to know, others are not. The forest keeps its secrets, and so do I. My name is David Salazar, and this happened to me back in 2017 in the White River National Forest, Colorado. The memories don't fade like normal ones should. They stay razor sharp, cutting into my mind during quiet moments when I let my guard down. The therapist says writing it down might help. I doubt it, but I'm out of options. We'd planned the trip for months. Just a simple outing. Me, my older brother Marco, and my 12-year-old daughter Isabel. A one-day loop to Nolan Lake and back. Nothing we hadn't done before. Nothing that should have gone wrong. The drive up from Denver took longer than expected. Road construction, then a detour through winding mountain passes that made Isabel queasy. By the time we parked our rented Winnebago on the gravel turnoff, dusk was settling into the valleys. The original plan, start at dawn, finish by sunset, was already compromised. We should wait until morning, Marco said, staring up at the darkening sky. His face caught the last light, highlighting the scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from his time in Afghanistan. Night hiking is stupid, David, I wanted to argue, but he was right. The mountains have their own logic after dark. Trails that seem obvious in daylight become treacherous puzzles under moonlight. So we settled in, Marco taking the fold-out couch, Isabel claiming the tiny bedroom, and me stretching out across the dining bench that converted to a bed that was 2 inches too short for my frame. That night, I dreamed of running. Not the pleasant kind where your feet barely touch the ground, but the desperate, lungs-burning flight of prey. I woke with sweat-soaked sheets tangled around my legs and a strange copper taste in my mouth. Outside, something moved in the brush, probably a deer or raccoon, but my heart hammered nonetheless. Dawn arrived with the mountains, smelling of pine sap and cold stone, the sort of scent that makes you think nothing bad can reach you up there, the kind of clean that feels like absolution. Marco busied himself with breakfast, powdered eggs and instant coffee, camping cuisine at its finest. Isabel sat cross-legged on a flat rock, her camera already out, snapping pictures of a blue jay that had taken interest in our crumbs. "You sleep okay?" Marco asked, not looking up from the small propane stove. "Fine," I lied. "You?" He shrugged. "Heard something moving around out there." Probably nothing, but there was tension in his shoulders that wasn't usually there. Marco had developed an almost preternatural sense for danger during his 3 tours. When he was on edge, it was wise to pay attention. We packed light. I carried my Ruger Scout Point .308. Marco toted his dad-gifted Remington shotgun, and Isabel swung her little camera like a badge of adventure. The guns weren't for anything specific, just standard precaution in bear country. At least, that's what we told Isabel. The truth was more complicated. The previous summer, a hiker had gone missing on the very trail we were taking. Search and rescue found his backpack, shredded and empty of food, but never found him. Officials blamed it on a rogue bear, but the incident report I'd found online mentioned details that didn't fit. Strange tracks, no blood evidence, and claw marks too wide for any recorded ursine species in Colorado. The trail started gentle enough, winding through dense ponderosa pines that filtered the morning sunlight into golden shafts. Isabel skipped ahead, her dark ponytail bouncing with each step. She was fearless in that way only children can be, untouched by the shadows that experience casts over everything. "She looks more like Anna every day," Marco said quietly, using my late wife's name with the careful reverence people reserve for the dead. "Yeah." The word came out rough. Anna had been gone 5 years now. Cancer that started in her breast and spread with ruthless efficiency to her bones, her liver, her brain. Isabel had been 7 when she died, old enough to understand but young enough to still expect miracles. "You're doing good with her," Marco continued. "Anna would be proud." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Marco had been my rock after Anna died, moving into our spare room for 6 months to help with Isabel, with the grief that threatened to drown me. If I was doing good, it was largely because of him. By mid-morning, we reached Nolan Lake. It sat in a natural bowl carved by ancient glaciers, the water so clear you could see 20 feet down to where trout hovered like living shadows. Isabel immediately began photographing the wildflowers that ringed the shoreline, columbines and Indian paintbrush creating splashes of purple and red against the green. We ate lunch on sun-warmed rocks, peanut butter sandwiches and trail mix. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the occasional call of an osprey circling overhead. This was why we came to the mountains, to find that quiet center that city life erodes. "There's an abandoned fire watch cabin up there," I said, pointing to a ridge about a mile further. "It's on the old maps, built in the 30s, during the CCC days. Thought we might check it out." Isabel perked up. "Can I take pictures inside?" "Sure, Misha." The Spanish endearment slipped out naturally, though my own Spanish was rudimentary at best. Another legacy from Anna, who had spoken it fluently. Marco squinted up at the ridge. "That's off trail, isn't it?" "A little. There's an old maintenance path that should get us there. He frowned. How far off? Half-mile. Tops. We'll still make it back to the RV well before dark. Marco nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. He'd always been the cautious one between us, even before the military honed that trait to a razor's edge. I'd always been the one pushing boundaries, taking risks. Usually, it was fine. Usually. The maintenance path was overgrown but visible enough to follow. A narrow track that switchbacked up the steep slope. The forest changed as we climbed, ponderosis giving way to lodgepole pines, and then to spruce and fir. The air thinned, and Isabel's cheeks flushed with exertion. "You okay?" I asked her during a water break. She nodded, too breathless to speak but smiling. That was Isabel, determined to keep up, to prove herself strong. Sometimes I worried that losing her mother so young had accelerated her growing up, robbed her of some essential childhood innocence. As we neared the ridge, a peculiar silence settled over the forest. No bird calls, no rustling underbrush, just the sound of our boots on rocky soil and our increasingly labored breathing. Even the wind seemed to have paused. I didn't recognize the unease for what it was then, the forest holding its breath in fear. The cabin appeared suddenly as we crested the ridge, a simple square structure with a peaked roof, weathered gray by decades of mountain winters. One window remained intact, the other was a jagged-edged hole. Sunlight struck the glass jaggedly, creating prismatic flashes that seemed oddly deliberate, like signals. "Cool," Isabel whispered, lifting her camera. Marco moved forward cautiously, shotgun held low but ready. I didn't comment on his weariness. There was something about the cabin that set my own nerves jangling. It looked wrong somehow. Not just abandoned, but violated. The door hung partially open. The wood around the hinges splintered as if it had been forced. Marco pushed it wider with the barrel of his shotgun, revealing a single room with a rusted metal cot, a toppled table, and a pot-bellied stove with its door yawning open like a black mouth. Inside, the air smelled rank, as if something wild had been bedding there. Claw marks, 5 long chisels, striped the doorframe. Not bear claws. Those would be more rounded, less precise. These were almost surgical in their straightness. Isabel stepped forward, her camera already raised, but I put a hand on her shoulder. "Wait," I said. "Let me check it out first." The floorboards creaked ominously under my weight. In one corner lay a pile of gnawed bones, deer mostly, judging by the slender leg bones, but also what looked disturbingly like a human-sized femur. I nudged it with my boot, hoping Isabel wouldn't notice. "What's that?" she asked, of course noticing immediately. "Deer bones," I said, telling a partial truth. "Something's been using this place as a den." Marco examined the claw marks on the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "These are fresh," he said quietly. "Maybe a week old." "Mountain lion?" I suggested, though I knew better. He shook his head. "Wrong pattern. Too wide." I felt a heaviness settle on my tongue, a metallic taste like fear. "Let's head back," I said. "I don't like this." We left the cabin without taking any photos, Isabel for once not protesting. As we descended the ridge, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something watching us from the cabin's empty window. There was nothing there, just darkness and a sense of wrongness that clung to us like cobwebs. The forest remained unnaturally quiet on our descent. Even our footfalls seemed muffled, as if the ground itself was absorbing sound. Isabel stayed between us now, no longer ranging ahead as she had on the ascent. She sensed it too, the shift in atmosphere, the presence of something unseen. "Dad?" she said softly. "I don't like it here anymore." "We're heading back, Mija," I assured her. "We'll be at the RV before you know it." But I was lying, and part of me already knew it. Because in wilderness like this, distance isn't measured in miles but in boundaries crossed, and we had stepped over an invisible line into territory that wasn't ours. Something had noticed us, marked us, and it was already too late to uncross that line. Around noon, the ridge opened to a meadow chewed to ruin. The grass lay flat in twisted whorls, as if a massive weight had rolled across it repeatedly. In the center, an elk lay in ribbons, ribs snapped, head twisted backward at an impossible angle. Flies hadn't found it yet. The kill was fresh, perhaps only hours old. "Jesus," Marco whispered, instinctively moving in front of Isabel to block her view. But she'd already seen it, her face draining of color. I moved closer, rifle ready. The carcass had been systematically dismembered, but not eaten, not completely. The choicest parts, the liver, the heart, the tender flank meat, were gone, but the rest remained, as if whatever killed it was selective, deliberate in its consumption. This wasn't predation for survival. This was something else. The prints surrounding the carcass looked like wolf tracks, stretched by some cruel joke. wide forepads tapering to almost human-like heels. Some measured nearly 14 inches long, larger than any wolf print I'd ever seen, larger than should be biologically possible. Marco nudged one with his boot. "How does anything walk on that?" His voice was steady, but I could see the tightness around his eyes, the way his fingers curled more firmly around his shotgun. I had no answer for him. The tracks defied explanation, defied natural law. They spoke of something that should not exist, could not exist, yet clearly did. "Dad?" Isabel's voice was small, frightened. "Can we go? Please?" "Yeah, baby. We're going." I pulled her close, feeling her trembling against me. "Let's move." We kept moving quicker now, Isabel sandwiched between us, our weapons held ready. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its westward slide, shadows lengthening across the trail. We needed to make better time if we wanted to reach the RV before dark. On the descent, we lost the trail for half an hour and argued in low voices about whose compass reading was right. Marco insisted we needed to head due west, while my topographic map suggested a more northwestern route would intersect with the main trail. The tension ratcheted higher with each passing minute, our voices taking on an edge that frightened Isabel more than the elk carcass had. That was when the forest went silent, the birds quitting all at once as if someone had pressed a switch. The sudden absence of sound was more alarming than any noise could have been, a vacuum that pressed against our eardrums with almost physical force. Isabel noticed first. She lifted a finger, eyes wide, but before she spoke, a barking snarl rolled through the trees. Not a bear, not a cougar. Something that carried a shape of language but no words. The sound raised the hair on the back of my neck, sent ice water trickling down my spine. "Move," Marco hissed, pushing Isabel ahead of him. Now, we abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through underbrush, sliding down scree slopes, our boots sending small avalanches of pebbles ahead of us. The sound came again, closer this time, a guttural howl that seemed to contain multitudes, rage, hunger, and something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. "It's hurting us," Marco panted as we paused behind a massive boulder, pushing us east. I checked my compass with shaking hands. He was right. We'd veered well off our intended course, driven by blind panic into unfamiliar territory. The sun was now hidden behind the western peaks, the forest rapidly descending into twilight. Getting back to the RV before dark was no longer possible. "We need to find shelter," I said. "Somewhere defensible." Marco nodded grimly. "There's a rock formation about 200 yards that way." He pointed south. "Saw it when we were coming up. Might give us some cover." Isabel clung to my hand, her palms slick with sweat. "Is it a bear, Dad?" she whispered. "I don't think so, Mija." I couldn't bring myself to lie to her. Not now. "But we're going to be okay, I promise." Another sound then. A heavy body moving through brush, branches snapping under significant weight. Close, too close. Perhaps 50 yards in closing. "Run," Marco said simply. And we did. The rock formation was a jumble of car-sized boulders, probably deposited by some ancient glacial retreat. They formed a natural fortress of sorts, with one particularly large slab creating a partial roof over a space big enough for the three of us to huddle in. Marco immediately began gathering smaller rocks to build a partial wall across the open side. "Help me," he ordered, and Isabel and I complied, stacking stones as quickly as we could. The activity gave Isabel something to focus on besides fear, her small hands working feverishly alongside ours. Darkness fell completely as we worked, the moon not yet risen. I flicked on my headlamp, its beam cutting a pale swath through the gathering gloom. In its light, Isabel's face looked ghostly, all huge eyes and taut skin. "It'll be okay," I told her again, trying to believe it myself. "We'll stay here tonight and head back to the RV at first light." Marco finished the wall, leaving just a narrow gap that would force anything trying to enter to squeeze through, a choke point we could defend. He positioned himself by this gap, shotgun resting across his knees. "I'll take first watch," he said. "You two try to get some sleep." I wanted to protest. It should have been me taking the first shift, but something in his expression stopped me. This was the Marco who had led men in combat, who had made life-or-death decisions in the worst possible circumstances. This was the Marco who knew what he was doing. So I nodded and settled back against the cold stone, pulling Isabel against me. I draped my jacket over her, though the night wasn't particularly cold. She curled into me like she used to as a toddler, small and vulnerable. "Try to sleep," I murmured, stroking her hair. "I can't," she whispered back. "I keep hearing things." I heard them too. Rustlings in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig. Sounds that could have been innocent nocturnal wildlife but felt deliberately ominous. Whatever had been tracking us was still out there, circling, waiting. "Tell me a story," Isabel said suddenly, like Mom used to. The request caught me off guard. opening an old wound. Anna had been the storyteller between us, spinning elaborate bedtime tales for Isabel featuring brave princesses and clever foxes. My stories were always too literal, too structured, engineering problems with clear solutions, not the open-ended adventures Isabel craved. Once upon a time, I began awkwardly, there was a girl who could talk to birds. What was her name? Isabel, I said, and felt her smile against my chest. Isabel could understand the language of birds, and they told her all the secrets of the forest. I continued the story, making it up as I went along, my voice low so as not to carry beyond our stone shelter. Isabel's breathing gradually slowed, her body relaxing against mine as she drifted toward sleep. Marco sat motionless by the gap in our wall, his silhouette sharp against the slightly lighter darkness outside. I must have dozed off eventually, because I snapped awake to Marco's hand on my shoulder, his finger pressed to his lips in the universal sign for silence. Isabel slept on, exhaustion having finally claimed her. Something's out there, Marco breathed, his mouth close to my ear. Circling, I eased Isabel off my chest and onto the ground, covering her with my jacket before taking up my rifle and crawling to the gap. Outside, the moon had risen, bathing the forest in silvery light that transformed familiar shapes into alien geometries. I strained my eyes and ears, searching for whatever had alarmed Marco. At first, nothing. Then, a shadow detached itself from a tree trunk about 30 yards away. Tall, impossibly tall, moving with a fluid grace that defied its size. It paused in a patch of moonlight, and I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a massive canine head atop a body that was all wrong. Too elongated, too upright. My breath caught in my throat. The rifle suddenly felt like a toy in my hands, inadequate protection against whatever this was. Beside me, Marco's knuckles whitened around his shotgun. The creature lifted its head, testing the air. I knew it could smell us, our sweat, our fear, our essential humanity. It took a step toward our shelter, then another. If it comes for us, Marco whispered, I'll hold it off. You take Isabel and run. I'm not leaving you. I hissed back. You will if it means saving her. I couldn't argue with that. Isabel's safety trumped everything, even my brother's life, even my own. The creature took another step forward, moonlight gleaming on what looked like wet fangs. Then, abruptly, it stiffened, head swiveling toward the north. A moment later, I heard it too. Voices, distant but distinct. Other hikers, maybe a search party. The creature hesitated, caught between its prey in the stone shelter and the new potential targets. Then it melted back into the shadows, moving with that same unnatural fluidity toward the voices. God help them, Marco muttered. We listened, tense and helpless, but heard no screams, no sounds of conflict. Eventually the voices faded, moving away from both us and the creature. Maybe they'd been lucky. Maybe the thing had decided we were easier targets and had circled back toward us. There was no way to know. We remained vigilant until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Isabel woke as the first birds began their tentative morning calls. Did it come back? She asked immediately, proving she'd been aware of more than I'd thought. No, I lied. We're fine, and now we're going to head back to the RV, okay? She nodded, accepting the lie because she needed to. We gathered our meager supplies and stepped out of our stone fortress into the deceptive tranquility of early morning. The forest looked innocent in the growing light, showing no sign of the horror that had stalked us through the night, but we knew better now. And as we oriented ourselves and began the trek back toward the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being allowed to leave, that our escape was a temporary reprieve, not a victory. I was right. We hiked in tense silence, moving as quickly as Isabel's shorter legs would allow. The forest seemed normal again, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the occasional rustle of larger animals moving away from our approach. But the peace felt tenuous, a thin veneer over something rotten. Marco led the way, his military training evident in the way he scanned our surroundings, alert to any hint of danger. I brought up the rear, constantly checking behind us, the nape of my neck prickling with the sensation of being watched. Isabel stayed between us, her camera forgotten in its case. By my estimation, we were about 2 miles from the RV when we found the backpack. It lay in the middle of the trail, torn and muddied but clearly recent. The fabric still bright, the zippers uncorroded. Marco approached it cautiously, nudging it with his boot before kneeling to examine it more closely. Day pack, he reported. High-end stuff. North Face. Someone dropped it? Isabel asked hopefully. Marco and I exchanged glances over her head. The pack hadn't been dropped, it had been ripped from someone's back with enough force to tear the reinforced straps. Dark stains spattered one side. Dried blood, though I didn't point this out to Isabel. Maybe, I said. Let's keep moving. But Marco was already rifling through the pack's contents. Driver's license, he said, holding up a wallet. Gerald Thompson, Denver address. Dated this year. Recent, I murmured. Marco nodded grimly. There's a park entrance receipt in here, dated yesterday. Yesterday. The knowledge sat like a stone in my stomach. Someone else had been in these woods very recently, and they hadn't made it out with their backpack. I thought of the voices we'd heard in the night, wondered if Gerald Thompson had been among them. We should report this when we get back, I said, taking the wallet from Marco and tucking it into my own pack. Come on, we continued on, the discovery adding urgency to our already hurried pace. The terrain began to look familiar. We were approaching the section of trail where we'd originally veered off toward the Firewatch cabin. The RV was perhaps an hour away now, less if we maintained our current pace. I need to pee, Isabel announced suddenly. I hesitated, not wanting to stop even briefly. But nature's call couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Okay, but make it quick. Marco and I will wait right here. She nodded and moved a few yards off the trail behind a large bush, still within sight, but with a modicum of privacy. Marco and I stood guard, back to back, scanning the forest. When we get back, Marco said quietly, we need to report everything. The cabin, the elk, the tracks, and Thompson's pack. They'll think we're crazy. Maybe. But if that thing's hunting in these woods, people need to know. He was right, of course. Whatever the consequences to our credibility, we couldn't in good conscience stay silent. Not if it meant other hikers might wander into the same nightmare we had. Isabel? I called, suddenly aware that she'd been gone for longer than necessary. You okay? No answer. Isabel? Louder now, alarm creeping into my voice. Marco was already moving toward the bush where she'd disappeared, shotgun raised. I followed, heart hammering against my ribs. She wasn't there. The ground behind the bush showed signs of a brief struggle. Disturbed earth, a small footprint, then larger, elongated prints that couldn't have been human. A few yards further, Isabel's blue windbreaker hung from a spruce limb, torn along one sleeve. Isabel! My scream echoed through the trees, returning to me empty. Marco grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. Quiet, he hissed. He'll bring it right to us. But I was beyond reason, terror overwhelming any sense of self-preservation. My daughter was gone, taken by the same creature that had stalked us through the night. Nothing else mattered. Isabel! I screamed again, wrenching free of Marco's grip. He slapped me, hard enough to snap my head back. The shock of it cut through my panic, brought me crashing back to a clarity that was almost worse. Listen to me, Marco said, his face inches from mine. We'll find her, but not if we're dead. So get it together, right now. I nodded, my cheek stinging, tears blurring my vision. Okay, I managed. Okay, good. Now let's track this thing. Marco had been a scout in the army, trained to read terrain, to follow the faintest signs of passage. Now he applied those skills with grim intensity, moving through the underbrush with a hunter's focus. I followed close behind, rifle ready, senses straining for any hint of Isabel. The tracks led away from the trail, following what appeared to be a game path worn by deer or elk. The creature moved with purpose, heading downhill toward a series of ravines that cut through the mountainside like scars. It's taking her somewhere specific, Marco murmured, pausing to examine a broken sapling. Not just running. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. If the creature had a destination in mind, it might not harm Isabel immediately, but it also meant it had plans for her. Plans I couldn't begin to comprehend and didn't want to imagine. We followed the tracks to a dry creek bed, the ground littered with smooth stones polished by long-gone water. Here, Marco lost the trail briefly, the hard ground refusing to hold prints. We cast about frantically, searching for any sign of which way they had gone. There, I said, pointing to a scrap of fabric caught on a thorny bush, the same blue as Isabel's windbreaker, and beside it, half hidden under a fallen leaf, lay her camera strap, torn and dirty, the lens cracked. My stomach folded in on itself. Marco's face tightened, his mustache twitching like a scared animal. He muttered a prayer in Spanish I hadn't heard since our mother's funeral, the words carrying a desperate plea for protection. We pushed on, following more torn bits of clothing, disturbed earth, broken vegetation. The ravine deepened, its walls rising around us like the sides of a grave. The air grew noticeably cooler, heavy with the smell of wet stone and something else, something rotten and musky that caught in the back of my throat. We're getting close to its den, Marco said, his voice barely audible. Fear washed over me in a cold wave. If we found the creature's lair, what would we find inside? I thought of the elk carcass, systematically dismembered, of Gerald Thompson's blood-stained backpack, of Isabel, small and fragile against the immensity of that thing's hunger, but there was no question of turning back. If there was even the slightest chance Isabel was still alive, we had to continue. And if she wasn't, then I wanted the satisfaction of putting a bullet through the brain of the thing that had taken her. The ravine widened into a small box canyon, its floor covered in dead leaves and scattered bones, mostly animal but some disturbingly human-like. At the far end, a dark opening yawned in the rock face, a cave, its entrance partially hidden by a fallen tree. We approached cautiously, every sense alert for danger. The musky smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. Something lived in that cave, something that fed regularly and well. I was about to suggest we approach from opposite sides when movement caught my eye. A small form curled beneath a fallen aspen about 20 yards to our right. A flash of pink t-shirt, dark hair. Isabel, I breathed, scarcely daring to hope. Marco had seen her too, and was already moving, shotgun aimed at the cave entrance to cover me as I sprinted toward my daughter. I reached her in seconds, dropping to my knees beside her huddled form. Isabel, Mija, it's Dad. I'm here. She uncurled slowly, eyes huge and wet and a face pale with terror. I knelt, pulled her out from under the aspen's protective branches. She shook so hard her teeth clicked, but she was alive, unharmed from what I could see. Tall dog, she whispered, the only word she seemed capable of forming. Tall dog. I gathered her into my arms, her small body feeling impossibly fragile against mine. She clung to me, fingers digging into my shoulders with desperate strength. I've got you, I murmured into her hair. I've got you. You're safe now. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. None of us were safe, not while that thing was still out there. And judging by the freshness of the spoor around the cave entrance, it hadn't gone far. We need to move, Marco urged, eyes still fixed on the cave. Now, before it comes back. I nodded, gathering Isabel closer. Can you walk, Misha? She nodded against my chest, though I wasn't convinced. Her legs, when she tried to stand, wobbled dangerously beneath her. Without hesitation, I scooped her up, cradling her against my chest as I had when she was a toddler. She was heavier now, but fear and adrenaline made her weight insignificant. We formed a triangle, weapons outward, and moved, Marco leading, me carrying Isabel in the middle, constantly scanning our surroundings for any sign of the creature's return. The ravine seemed longer on the way out, the climb back to the game trail steeper. Isabel's weight began to tell on my arms and back, but I refused to put her down, terrified that if I let go of her for even a moment, she would vanish again. Shadows lengthened as afternoon slid toward evening. The forest took on the golden hue of late day, deceptively peaceful. Every snap of twig sounded deliberate, stalking us just beyond what the eye could grasp. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed for flight, but running invites pursuit. So we walked, slow and steady, Marco's training keeping us to a sustainable pace. Isabel had stopped shaking, but she remained silent, face buried against my shoulder. Whatever she had seen, whatever had happened during her captivity, had affected her deeply. I found myself hoping she wouldn't remember, even as I knew that was unlikely. Some horrors carved themselves too deeply to be forgotten. We were about halfway back to the RV, the trail finally visible ahead, when the thing stepped onto the path. 8, maybe 9 feet high, it stood on legs bent backward at the knee, torso lean like a marathoner's but wound with ropey muscle that shifted beneath patchy fur. The fur, charcoal and patchy, clung to the shoulders and haunches but left much of the torso bare, revealing grayish skin stretched over an anatomy that was almost but not quite human. Arms longer than a man's hung at its sides, ending in hands that could close over my entire skull, tipped with curved claws that looked capable of gutting a bear. But it was the head that froze the breath in my lungs. Unmistakably canine, but wrong. All wrong. The muzzle sat askew, as if broken and healed badly, scarred white where flesh never grew back. One ear hung in tatters, the other stood erect, swiveling, gauging distance, and the eyes. Yellow, glassy, intelligent, assessing. Not animal eyes, though not human either. Something in between. Something that understood cruelty and enjoyed it. It stood perfectly still, watching us with those terrible eyes. The only movement the slight rise and fall of its chest as it breathed. In, out, unhurried, confident. Isabel made a small broken sound against my chest. I tightened my grip on her, my other hand raising the rifle despite the awkwardness of the position. Marco had already leveled his shotgun, his stance solid, hand steady despite what must have been overwhelming fear. For a long moment, we stood frozen in tableau, the creature blocking the path ahead. Marco and I with our weapons raised, Isabel trembling in my arms. The silence stretched, broken only by our ragged breathing and the distant call of a crow, oblivious to the drama unfolding below. Then the creature smiled. There's no other word for it. Its ruined muzzle pulled back, revealing yellowed fangs and a grotesque parody of human expression. The message was clear. It was toying with us. We were not prey that had escaped. We were prey that had been released, allowed to believe in the possibility of escape, before being reminded of our true position. It dropped to all fours and sprinted. The movement was so sudden, so explosively fast, that I barely had time to raise my rifle before it was halfway to us. I fired. The first round punched into its ribcage, popped hair in a mist of dark. It staggered but never slowed, the wound seeming to anger rather than weaken it. Marco let off both shotgun barrels. Buckshot patterned the creature's chest. More dark spray, but still it came. Momentum undiminished. If anything, the wound seemed to fuel its rage, its yellow eyes blazing with hateful intensity. The beast veered, crashed shoulder first into a ponderosa pine. Bark flew, the entire tree shuddering with the impact. For a heartbeat, I thought it had injured itself, bought us precious seconds, but it was just changing tactics, redirecting its charge to circle around Marco's position. I jammed another magazine home, firing until the bolt clicked on empty. At least 3 rounds hit home. I saw the impacts, saw flesh tear and dark blood spray, but the creature barely slowed. It was as if we were shooting at a freight train, our bullets mere annoyances against its mass and momentum. "Run!" Marco shouted, reloading his shotgun with practiced efficiency. "Get Isabel out of here." I hesitated, unwilling to leave him facing that thing alone. But Isabel's safety had to come first. Marco and I were in agreement on that, had always been. "Go!" he bellowed, and this time I obeyed, turning to sprint toward the RV with Isabel clutched against my chest. Behind me, Marco fired again, the shotgun's roar followed by an inhuman shriek of pain or rage. Impossible to tell which. I didn't look back, focusing instead on the path ahead, on the increasingly leaden weight of Isabel in my arms, on the burning in my lungs as I pushed my body beyond its limits. Isabel screamed my name, the sound piercing even through the fog of exertion. The warning pulled me sideways enough that the thing's claws, curved like sickles, merely raked my left forearm instead of disemboweling me as intended. Heat bloomed along the wound, wet and sticky. I was bleeding, though adrenaline kept the pain at bay for now. I tumbled, somehow managing to twist so that Isabel landed on top of me, rather than beneath. My rifle skittered out of reach, useless now. I scrambled to my feet, pushing Isabel behind me as the creature circled, its movements almost lazy now, enjoying our fear. Then Marco was there, vaulting over a fallen log, swinging his Remington like a club. Steel met snout with a dull crack. The beast recoiled, teeth flashing under the moon's first silver glow as it snarled in surprised pain. "Run to the truck!" I barked at Isabel. "Now!" No thought. Pure reflex. We bolted. Isabel first, me bleeding after her, Marco guarding the rear. The creature followed, silent but thunderous in impact, trees shaking as it careened through the underbrush. I felt rather than saw it pacing our flank, probing for angles of attack, toying with us as a cat toys with mice. The Winnebago was visible now, its white bulk reflecting the last of the daylight. 30 yards, 25. We might make it. We might actually make it. The beast had other ideas. It sprang sideways, cutting across the clearing, intercepting our path with terrifying intelligence. It knew where we were heading and had calculated the shortest route to cut us off. This wasn't mindless predation, this was strategy. Marco shoved Isabel toward the RV, then turned, planting himself between the creature and us. He raised the shotgun, but the thing swept his legs with one fluid swing of its massive arm. Bones snapped, the sound like dry ice cracking, and Marco hit the ground screaming, weapon flying from his grasp. I reached the RV ladder, pushed Isabel up, yelled at her to get inside and lock the cab. She obeyed, eyes wild but clear, her instinct for survival overriding her terror. I spun, snatched a flare from my belt, sparked it. Magenta fire leapt, spitting sparks. I hurled it at the beast's face. It recoiled, pawing at the sizzling embers clinging to its fur. The momentary distraction gave me the seconds I needed. I grabbed Marco under the armpits and dragged him toward the RV, his broken leg trailing uselessly. He bit his forearm to keep from shouting, veins bulging with the effort of containing his pain. We made the door. Isabel yanked us in and slammed the compromised panel home, wedging it with the fire extinguisher. The beast hit the side hard, the whole RV rocked, cabinets dumped plates. Isabel shrieked as glass shattered around us. I scrambled to the driver's seat, keys already in the ignition. Thank God for that small mercy. The engine coughed, caught. Headlights poured white over a sheet of fur in front of the windshield. The creature reared, paws slapping glass, spider webbing cracks across the windshield. I jammed the throttle. The RV lurched, smacked the beast with a hollow thud, then ground forward. wheels spitting gravel. For 50 yards I kept my foot welded to the pedal, willing the ancient vehicle to move faster, to carry us away from the nightmare behind us. Then the rear axle lifted, weight on the bumper. The beast had hauled itself onto the ladder, claws screeching over metal toward the roof. Isabel screamed, pointing upward as the ceiling dented inward from the creature's weight. I saw a dead spruce ahead, trunk wide as a stove. At 50 miles an hour in that old rig, impact would be devastating. But if I didn't do something drastic, we weren't going to make it out of these mountains alive. I aimed for the tree, bracing myself as best I could. The impact hammered us sideways, the Winnebago groaning as metal tore and glass shattered. Something heavy flew off the roof, thudded into underbrush. The RV skidded, tires smoking, but miraculously stayed upright. Silence settled, ragged and thin. I glanced back at Marco, who lay pale and sweating on the floor, his leg bent at an angle that made my stomach churn. Isabel crouched beside him, her small hand on his forehead in a gesture of comfort that broke my heart. "Is it gone?" she whispered. Before I could answer, a screech of dorsal metal answered for me. The roof vent ripped away, and an arm snaked through, feeling for purchase. Yellow eyes peered over the edge, fixing on Isabel in the passenger seat. The creature had survived the impact, its determination to reach us undiminished. Marco, pale from blood loss, raised the Remington one-handed. He must have recovered it during our flight. The blast roared, filling the cabin with powder haze. The arm yanked back, wrist dangling by threads of sinew and skin. The beast dropped behind us, rolling, then vanished into the gathering darkness. Whether it was finally injured enough to retreat or simply regrouping for another attack, I didn't wait to find out. I gunned the engine again, the damaged RV protesting but moving, carrying us away from that place of shadows and teeth. I drove until asphalt appeared, until the ranger station lights broke through the dark like a promise of safety. We spilled out, blood on our clothes, Marco on a stretcher inside 5 minutes, Isabel wrapped in a shock blanket, me tied tight with gauze around my lacerated arm. The rangers were professional, efficient, asking few questions beyond the immediate necessities. I caught the look that passed between two of them when I mentioned a creature attack, skepticism tinged with concern for our mental state. They'd heard stories like ours before, I realized, and they had their official explanation ready. Rogue bear, possibly rabid wolf, mountain lion protecting territory. But they followed us to the campsite at first light. They found the prints, the elk carcass, the clawed door of the cabin, the shredded vent of the RV. They photographed everything, took samples of the dark fluid that might have been the creature's blood. And they spoke in clipped voices about an aggressive predator, about relocation orders and hunting permits. They never once made me feel wrong about what we'd seen. But neither did they acknowledge the truth of it, that what had hunted us through those mountains wasn't anything recognized by science, wasn't anything that should exist in a rational world. I didn't press the point. What would have been the use? The rangers had their reports to file, their superiors to satisfy, and I had a traumatized daughter and an injured brother to care for. The truth could wait, maybe forever. I paid cash to have the Winnebago scrapped that week. The rental company wasn't happy, but their insurance covered it, and I couldn't bear the thought of ever seeing that vehicle again, with its torn roof and blood-spattered interior. Some things you don't repair. You discard them and try to forget they ever existed. Marco spent 3 weeks in the hospital. His right femur had been fractured in 2 places, requiring surgical pins and a steel rod to stabilize. The doctors marveled at the bear's strength, at the precision of the break. When they asked for details of the attack, Marco gave them the sanitized version we'd agreed upon, a large predator, possibly a grizzly, though we hadn't gotten a good look at it. The lie tasted bitter, but what was the alternative? To speak of 9-foot wolf men with near-human intelligence, to describe yellow eyes that understood cruelty. We'd be dismissed as trauma victims, our testimony discredited, and if others ventured into those mountains unprepared for what lurked there, that would be on us. So we kept the truth between us, a burden shared but undiminished. Isabel didn't speak for 2 days after we returned to Denver. When she finally did, it was to ask if the tall dog could find us in the city. I told her no, that creatures like that stayed in the deep wilderness, far from human habitation. I had no evidence for this, just a desperate hope and a father's need to reassure his child. She seemed to accept it, or at least to recognize my need for her to accept it. The nightmares began the following week. Isabel would wake screaming, thrashing against invisible restraints, eyes wide but unseeing. It took sometimes an hour to calm her, to convince her she was safe, that the tall dog couldn't reach her here. During the day she jumped at shadows, flinched at sudden movements, loud noises, a car backfiring, a door slamming, could send her into a state of paralyzed terror. The child psychologist we consulted diagnosed PTSD. No surprise there. She recommended a regimen of therapy, possibly medication if the symptoms didn't improve. She also suggested that Isabel take up an activity that would help her feel more in control, more capable of defending herself. So Isabel began taking judo classes. The physical discipline seemed to help center her, to give her a framework for managing her fear. The nightmares didn't stop, but they became less frequent, less intense. She still wouldn't go near parks or wooded areas, still kept a flashlight by her bed, but she was functioning, healing, in her way. Marco walks with a steel rod in his leg now, a slight limp that becomes more pronounced when he's tired or the weather changes. He moved in with us after being released from the hospital, converting my home office into a bedroom. Neither of us said it aloud, but we both recognized the need to stay close, to maintain the protective triangle we'd formed in those mountains. He still wakes shouting sometimes, his combat PTSD now compounded by fresh trauma. On those nights I find him in the kitchen, cleaning his shotgun by the dim light over the stove. We sit together in silence. The ritual of weapon maintenance a kind of meditation for him, a way of asserting control over the uncontrollable. As for me, I traded wildlife photography for indoor studio work. The thought of returning to those mountains, of pointing my camera into shadows that might contain yellow eyes and sharp teeth, is unbearable. I've become an expert in still lifes, in carefully controlled lighting and composition. My new work lacks the wild beauty of my nature photography, but it's precise, technical, safe, and every trail map in my house carries a thick red X across Colorado's White River National Forest, and no one will ever talk me into erasing it. But the worst part isn't the nightmares, or the changes to our lives, or even the constant undercurrent of fear. The worst part is the not knowing what that thing was, where it came from, how many more like it might exist in the remote corners of wilderness. Not knowing if it's still out there, hunting other hikers, other families who venture too far from the marked trails. Sometimes I scan local news reports for missing hikers, for animal attacks in Colorado's backcountry. I've started a file. Dates, locations, descriptions of what was found and what wasn't. There's a pattern there, faint but discernible. Clusters of disappearances every few years, always in the same general region, always during the late summer or early fall, always described officially as tragic accidents or presumed bear attacks. I've thought about going public with what we saw, what we know. But who would believe us, and what would it accomplish, beyond branding us as lunatics, perhaps causing Isabel to be taken from me by well-meaning social services concerned about her mental environment? So I keep silent. We all do. We've rebuilt our lives around the hollow space that experience carved in us, adapted to living with the knowledge that the world is not what most people believe it to be, that the darkness contains things with teeth and intelligence and malice, that survival sometimes means accepting wounds that never fully heal. Last week, Isabel asked me if we could go camping this summer. Not in the mountains, she clarified quickly, seeing my expression, but maybe at one of the state parks, with their well-maintained campgrounds and ranger stations and crowds of other people. The safe kind of wilderness, sanitized and surveilled. I wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed against it, but her eyes held a tentative hope, a testing of boundaries, and I recognized it for what it was, a step toward reclaiming something that had been taken from her. Her fearlessness, her love of nature, her belief in her own safety in the world. Things no child should lose, certainly not at 12. We'll see, I told her, which in parent speak usually means no. But maybe, just maybe, this time it means what it says. We'll see, we'll try. We'll attempt to find our way back to some version of the people we were before, because the alternative is to let that thing win, to let it continue hunting us long after we escaped its forest, its claws, its hunger, to surrender not just our bodies but our spirits to the fear it planted in us, and I refuse to give it that satisfaction. So we'll see. We'll take small steps back toward the light, toward normalcy. We'll tell ourselves that what happened in White River National Forest was an aberration, a nightmare intersection of our path with something ancient and awful that usually keeps to deeper shadows. We'll pretend to believe it, and maybe someday we actually will. But every trail map in my house will continue to carry that thick red X across Colorado, and no one, not even Isabel, will ever talk me into erasing it. Some boundaries once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Some knowledge once gained cannot be unlearned. Some wounds once opened can only be managed, never truly healed. My name is David Salazar, and this happened to me back in 2017 in the White River National Forest, Colorado. I've written it down now, as my therapist suggested, though I doubt it will help. Some horrors aren't exorcised by being named. They're only given stronger shape, more persistent form. But if you're reading this, and if you're planning a hiking trip to Colorado's backcountry, stay on the marked trails. Don't venture up to abandoned firewatch cabins, no matter how interesting they might seem on old maps. Don't dismiss strange tracks or inexplicable animal remains. And if the forest goes suddenly, completely silent around you, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and don't look back, because there are things in this world that science hasn't cataloged, that reason can't explain. Things that stand 9 feet tall on backward-bending legs, with yellow eyes that understand cruelty. Things that hunt not just for food but for sport, for the pleasure of fear. Things with just enough humanity to make their monstrousness all the more terrifying. And they're hungry. Always hungry. For flesh, yes, but even more for fear. For the particular flavor of terror that only comes when prey recognizes its true position in the food chain. When it realizes that all its technology, all its civilization, all its assumed dominance counts for nothing against teeth and claws and ancient hunger. I know this now. Marco knows it. Isabel knows it, though we try to help her forget. And somewhere in the White River National Forest, padding silently through pine shadows on massive paws, something knows that we know. Something remembers our scent, our taste, the particular timbre of our screams. Something waits, patient as only a perfect predator can be, for the day we make the mistake of returning to its territory. But we won't. Some lessons, once learned, cannot be unlearned. Some fears, once faced, should never be faced again. Stay on the trails. Stay safe, stay human, and if you hear something in the forest that sounds almost like language but contains no words, run. Run, and don't stop running until you reach asphalt and electric light and the comforting illusion that you stand at the top of the food chain, because you don't. We never did. And the sooner you accept that truth, the better your chances of survival. The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jolting me from a restless doze in the ranger station. 23 years I'd worked for the Forest Service in the Manitoulin Wilderness area, and middle-of-the-night calls still made my gut clench. Station 7, this is dispatch. We've got a missing hiker near Wekiva Lake. Family reported her overdue by 12 hours. I rubbed my eyes, already reaching for my gear. Copy that, dispatch. Send me the details. The printer hummed to life, spitting out a standard missing persons form. Jessica Rodriguez, 28, experienced hiker. Last seen heading up the Thanatos Trail toward the old mining camp. Her boyfriend had expected her back by sunset. I'd rescued dozens of lost hikers over the years. Most were dehydrated city folks who'd underestimated the wilderness. But something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the location. Thanatos Trail ran through some of the oldest, darkest parts of the forest. The kind of place where cell phones found no signal, and compasses spun wildly. I loaded my pack. First aid kit, emergency blankets, flares, rope, water, and my service rifle. Protocol demanded I wait for backup, but the nearest ranger was 3 hours away. Every minute counted when someone was lost in these woods. The truck's headlights carved through the pre-dawn darkness as I drove the winding forestry roads. Dense pine and cedar pressed in on both sides, their branches scraping the vehicle like reaching fingers. I'd grown up in these mountains, learned their moods and secrets, but they still unnerved me in the dead of night. At the Thanatos trailhead, Jessica's red Honda sat alone in the gravel lot. I checked inside. Her phone lay on the passenger seat, dead battery. Typical. Hikers always overestimated their device's staying power in the cold mountain air. I shouldered my pack and clicked on my headlamp. The trail disappeared into a tunnel of ancient trees, their trunks wider than my truck. Somewhere in that darkness, a woman needed help. The first mile passed quietly, my boots crunching on frost-brittle leaves. Then I heard it, a sound that made me freeze mid-step, a baby crying. The wail drifted through the trees, high and plaintive. But there were no camping areas nearby, no reason for an infant to be out here. I listened harder, and ice crawled up my spine. The cry repeated. Exactly the same pitch, same duration, same warbling notes. Like a recording on a loop. I'd heard stories from other rangers about strange sounds in the deep woods. Cougars that screamed like women. Owls that mimicked human voices. But this was different. This was wrong. The crying continued, seeming to move through the forest, always staying just out of sight. I forced myself forward, calling Jessica's name every few minutes. My voice echoed back, distorted by the trees. 2 miles in, I found her backpack. It sat in the middle of the trail, pristine and carefully placed, not dropped or discarded, positioned. I knelt beside it, noting the undisturbed dust around it. No drag marks, no signs of struggle. Inside, everything was perfectly organized. Water bottles full, granola bars untouched, emergency whistle still clipped to the strap. The baby's cry had stopped. The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. I scanned the forest with my flashlight. That's when I saw the footprints. They led off the trail into the underbrush. Bare human feet, but wrong somehow. The toes were too long, the arch too high, and beside them, another set of tracks. Animal prints, but I couldn't identify them. They shifted and changed, sometimes resembling a large dog, sometimes a bear, sometimes something else entirely. My radio crackled with static. Through the white noise, I heard a voice. Faint, distorted, but unmistakably Jessica's. "Help me. Please." The old cabin. The transmission cut off. I tried to respond, but got only dead air. There was an old mining cabin about a mile further up the trail, abandoned since the 1940s. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, call for backup, wait for daylight. But Jessica's voice had sounded terrified. I followed the strange tracks deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer, their branches forming a canopy so thick that my headlamp barely penetrated the darkness. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, and my breath came out in white puffs. The cabin materialized from the gloom like something from a nightmare. Its wooden walls had turned black with age, and the roof sagged under the weight of decades. The door hung open, revealing an interior darker than the night itself. I approached slowly, hand on my rifle. "Jessica? Forest Service, are you in there?" Silence. I stepped onto the creaking porch. My light swept the cabin's interior, a single room with a dirt floor, empty except for an old metal cot frame, and a figure stood in the corner, facing the wall. "Jessica?" My voice came out as a whisper. The figure turned, and my blood turned to ice water. It wore Jessica's clothes, had her general shape and height. But the face was wrong. Features seemed to shift and blur in my light, as if I was looking at her through rippling water. And the eyes, they reflected my beam like an animal's, glowing yellow-green in the darkness. It smiled with too many teeth and spoke in Jessica's voice. "Thank you for coming." Then it dropped to all fours and moved toward me with a fluidity that human joints shouldn't allow. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my rifle. The thing that wore Jessica's shape circled me, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, always keeping those terrible eyes fixed on mine. When it spoke again, it used my mother's voice, my mother who'd been dead for 15 years. "Come inside, honey. It's cold out there." I ran. Behind me something laughed, a sound that started as human and ended as the scream of a hunting cat. Branches tore at my clothes as I crashed through the underbrush. My headlamp beam swung wildly, turning the forest into a kaleidoscope of shadows. I don't remember reaching my truck. One moment I was running through the trees, the next I was fumbling with my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I looked back at the trailhead. A figure stood at the forest's edge. In the red glow of my taillights, I saw Jessica Rodriguez, the real Jessica. She was naked, covered in dirt and scratches, swaying on her feet. Her eyes were human, terrified, pleading. I threw the truck in reverse, but she collapsed before I could reach her. By the time I got to where she'd stood, nothing remained but strange tracks in the gravel, tracks that led back into the trees. I called it in, of course. Brought a full search team out at first light. We found Jessica Rodriguez 3 days later, huddled in a cave 10 miles from any trail. She had no memory of how she got there, remembered nothing after setting up camp her first night. The doctor said she was physically unharmed but severely dehydrated. She never went hiking again. The other rangers didn't believe my story. Hallucinations brought on by exhaustion, they said. Mountain madness. Carbon monoxide from a faulty truck heater. But I knew what I'd seen in that cabin. What had worn Jessica's face like a mask. I put in for a transfer the next week. Got stationed at a nice, safe desert park where the biggest danger was rattlesnakes and heat stroke. Where the night sounds were just coyotes and wind. But sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back on the Thanatasasa Trail. And something in the darkness is calling my name and the voices of everyone I've ever loved. My transfer request was denied. "Look, Mackenzie," Chief Ranger Brennan said, sliding the paperwork back across his desk. "I can't lose my most experienced ranger because of one weird night. Take a week off. Get your head straight." I wanted to argue, to tell him about the tracks that changed shape, about the thing wearing Jessica's face, but I'd tried that already. The skeptical looks from my colleagues had taught me to keep quiet, so I took the week off. Spent it poring over old incident reports in the station's archives, looking for patterns I'd been too blind to see before. What I found made my hands shake. 1987. Hiker reported hearing his deceased wife calling for help near Weekiva Lake. Found 3 days later. Catatonic. 1993. Family of 4 vanished on the Caloosahatchee Trail. Only the youngest child was recovered, unable to speak for months afterward. When she finally did, she insisted the man with backwards feet had taken her family. 2001. Experienced hunting guide found wandering naked through the forest, claiming something had stolen his skin. Died in the psychiatric ward, clawing at his own face. 2009. Search and rescue team reported finding stairs in the woods, a perfectly preserved wooden staircase, leading nowhere, miles from any structure. 2 team members who climbed them were never quite right afterward. 2016. A ranger, one who'd worked here even longer than me, abandoned his post mid-shift. His final log entry read, "It knows my name. It knows all our names." Dozens more, stretching back decades. All dismissed as accidents, mental breaks, or wildlife encounters. But I saw the pattern now. The locations clustered around the oldest parts of the forest, the native sites, the places where even the indigenous peoples had once feared to tread. My week off ended too soon. Brennan put me on day shifts only, partnered with Jake Morrison, a rookie eager to prove himself. Jake was 24, fresh from the academy, all muscles and misplaced confidence. He reminded me of myself at that age, before the forest had taught me humility. We were checking hiking permits at the Timpanogos Trail when the call came in. "All units, we have a situation at the old Manitoulin cabin. Hikers report finding human remains." Jake's eyes lit up with excitement. I felt only dread. The Manitoulin cabin sat deep in the restricted zone, where tourists weren't supposed to go. Same area where I'd found Jessica Rodriguez. The hikers who'd made the discovery sat on a log, faces pale. A young couple from the city, clearly shaken. "We were just exploring," the man stammered. "Thought it would be cool to see the old cabin. But inside, God, the smell." I left Jake to take their statement and approached the cabin. It looked different in daylight. Smaller, more ordinary, just a rotten structure slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But that smell rolling out the door was unmistakable. Death. But not fresh death. Old death, mixed with something else. Something animal. I covered my nose and stepped inside. The body lay in the corner, exactly where I'd seen the thing that wore Jessica's face. But this wasn't Jessica. The remains were male, dressed in the tatters of a Forest Service uniform. The badge was still visible. Henderson, Tom Henderson, the ranger who'd abandoned his post in 2016. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what surrounded him. Skins, animal pelts covered the walls, deer, bear, coyote, wolf. But mixed among them were other things, patches that looked disturbingly like human skin, preserved and stretched on wooden frames. Some still had hair. One had a tattoo I recognized, a rose wrapped in barbed wire, exactly like the one on Jessica Rodriguez's shoulder. Jake appeared in the doorway behind me. Jesus Christ, what is this place? Before I could answer, we heard it. Singing. A woman's voice, drifting through the trees. Not English, something older. The melody rose and fell in patterns that hurt to follow, like trying to track a bird flying directly at the sun. Jake reached for his radio, but I grabbed his wrist. "Don't." "What? Why?" How could I explain? That I'd heard this singing before, in my dreams. That the old reports mentioned it too, always just before someone vanished. That there were rules in these woods older than the Forest Service, older than any government. The singing grew closer. Through the cabin's broken window, I saw movement between the trees. A figure in a tattered dress, hair hanging to her waist, walking with steps that didn't quite match the rhythm of a human gait. "We need to leave," I whispered. "Now." But Jake was already moving toward the door, hand on his weapon. "Ma'am, Forest Service, are you all right?" The singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even our breathing seemed muffled. Then the figure turned toward us, and I saw her face. It was beautiful. Too beautiful. Like someone had studied human features and created a perfect approximation without understanding the subtle imperfections that make a face real. When she smiled, her lips stretched too wide. "Rangers," she said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "How wonderful. I've been waiting." Jake stepped forward, still playing the hero. "Waiting for what?" "For you to join the others, of course." She gestured to the cabin, and suddenly I understood. The skins weren't trophies. They were disguises. And Tom Henderson hadn't been a victim. He'd been a recruit. The woman's form began to shift and blur. Her dress became fur. Her hair became a mane. Her perfect face elongated into a snout. But her eyes, those remained intelligent, calculating, amused. Jake finally understood the danger. He reached for his gun, but I was already dragging him backward. We ran, crashing through the underbrush as something pursued us, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, always laughing in that terrible wind voice. We made it to the truck through pure luck and adrenaline. As we peeled out, I glimpsed multiple figures at the forest's edge. Some wore animal shapes, others looked human until you noticed the wrong joint bending the wrong way, or eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator's. One of them waved. It had Tom Henderson's face. Back at the station, we filed our report. "Animal attack," we wrote. "Mountain lion, probably rabid. The body in the cabin was too decomposed for proper identification. The skins were from poaching activities. Case closed. Jake quit the next week. Moved back to the city, last I heard. Never spoke about what we saw. Smart kid, I stayed. Someone had to. Someone who knew the truth, who could steer hikers away from the old trails, who could recognize the signs. Someone who understood that the forest had rules, and breaking them came with a price. But late at night, when the station is quiet and the woods press close against the windows, I wonder if I'm protecting people from the forest, or if I'm protecting the forest until it's ready to collect what it's owed. The dream started 3 weeks after the Manitoulin cabin incident. Always the same. I'd wake in my bed at the ranger station, but the walls would be wrong. Too far away, or too close, or made of trees that still grew leaves. And outside my window, Tom Henderson would be standing in the darkness, wearing his ranger uniform like an ill-fitting costume. "You can't fight it forever, Mackenzie," he'd say in a voice full of wind and distance. "The forest chooses who it chooses." I'd wake gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of pine sap in my mouth. The day shifts blurred together. I guided tourists along safe trails, checked permits, gave talks about leave no trace principles, but I also did other things. Removed trail markers that led too deep, reported certain paths as washed out when they were perfectly clear, created bureaucratic obstacles for anyone wanting to explore the old growth areas. Brennan noticed, of course. "You're getting paranoid, Mackenzie. Maybe it's time you took early retirement." Maybe he was right. But then we got the call about the Loxahatchee Lake incident. A group of college students had gone camping in the restricted zone. Another bunch who thought rules didn't apply to them. Their social media posts stopped abruptly 3 days into their trip. When we found their campsite, everything was intact. Tents still standing, food still in bare containers, expensive cameras and phones laid out on a picnic table like an offering. But the students were gone. All except one. We found her sitting in the middle of their camp, perfectly still, staring at nothing. Maria Gonzalez, according to her student ID. She didn't respond to voices, to touch, to light shined in her eyes. The EMTs said it was catatonic shock. I stayed behind after the medical helicopter left, studying the scene. That's when I noticed the tracks. Not the chaotic prints of a struggle, but a deliberate pattern circling the camp. Human feet walking clockwise, then the same feet, judging by size and gait, walking counterclockwise on all fours. The ritual had been performed 3 times, creating a perfect triple spiral in the dirt. I'd seen that pattern before, in the old reports, in the indigenous petroglyphs hidden deep in the forest. In my dreams, my radio crackled. "Mackenzie, you there? We found something." It was Phillips, one of the newer rangers, searching the north shore of the lake. I hiked over to find him standing at the water's edge, face pale. "Look," he said, pointing at the water. The lake was crystal clear, fed by mountain springs. 20 feet down, clearly visible on the sandy bottom, were the missing students. They stood in a circle, holding hands, eyes open, perfectly preserved by the cold water. Their mouths moved in unison, as if singing. That's impossible," Phillips whispered. "They'd have to be alive," I finished. We called in the dive team. It took 6 hours to recover the bodies, and yes, they were bodies by then. "Drowned," the coroner said, though he couldn't explain the lack of decomposition or their positioned poses. The students had been dead for at least 2 days before we found Maria, but I'd seen their mouths moving. That night, I broke protocol. I went to the hospital where they were keeping Maria Gonzalez. The psychiatric ward was quiet, most patients sedated for the night. Maria sat in her bed, still staring at nothing. I pulled up a chair. "I know you can hear me. I've seen what you've seen. The thing that wears faces, the singers in the forest, the ones who walk on 4 legs when they think no one's watching." Her eyes flickered, focused on me for just a moment. "They let you go for a reason," I continued. "Same reason they let Jessica Rodriguez go. You're supposed to tell others, aren't you? Spread the fear, make people curious, draw them in." Maria's lips moved. No sound at first, then a whisper so faint I had to lean close. "They're hungry." "Hungry for what?" "For us. Always have been. The old people knew, made bargains, gave them what they needed. But we forgot, stopped feeding them. So now they take." Her hand shot out, grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Her nails dug in deep enough to draw blood. "It knows you, Ranger Mackenzie. Knows you've been watching, protecting. But protection time is over. Collection time is coming. The forest wants its due." She released me and went back to her catatonic state. Nothing the doctors did could make her speak again. I drove back to the station through fog thick as wool. The forest pressed close against the road, and in my headlights I kept seeing shapes that weren't quite human, weren't quite animal. By the time I reached the station, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. Inside, everything looked normal. My desk, my reports, my coffee mug with its faded Forest Service logo. But on my chair sat a bundle wrapped in deer hide. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed to run. to finally take that transfer, to leave and never look back. But I had to know. Inside the bundle were 3 items: a photograph of me, taken from a distance, standing at the edge of the restricted zone. In the background, barely visible among the trees, were dozens of figures, watching, waiting. A map of the forest, hand-drawn on what looked like tanned hide. It showed trails I'd never seen, camps I'd never heard of, and symbols that hurt to look at directly. One location was circled in what might have been dried blood, a place deep in the wilderness marked with a symbol that looked like a human becoming an animal, or perhaps the reverse. And finally, a single page torn from a journal. Tom Henderson's journal, dated the day before he disappeared. They've shown me the truth. We were never the wardens of this forest. We were the shepherds, keeping the flock contained until harvest time. But the old agreement is ending. The barriers are breaking down. What was kept separate will merge. What was human will become other. The transformation has already begun. I can feel my skin loosening, my bones eager to reshape. By the time anyone reads this, I'll be free. We'll all be free. Or trapped. I can no longer tell the difference. I burned the bundle in the station's fireplace, but the smell lingered. Pine sap and old copper and something wild. That was 2 nights ago. Since then, I've been preparing. Loading my truck with supplies, writing reports that tell enough truth to warn but not enough to sound insane. Leaving breadcrumbs for whoever comes after me, because I understand now. The forest isn't just hungry, it's patient. It's been waiting for us to remember our place in the food chain, to recall the bargains our ancestors made and broke. The things in the woods aren't invaders or monsters. They're the landlords, come to collect rent we've refused to pay for generations. Tomorrow, I'm going to the circled location on that map, not because I want to, but because the dreams have made it clear I don't have a choice. The forest has been calling, and eventually, everyone answers. I'm leaving this record in case I don't come back as myself. Or in case I do come back, but wrong, wearing my face like an ill-fitting mask. If that happens, don't trust me. Don't listen when I tell you the woods are safe, that the old trails are open again, that the restrictions have been lifted. The restrictions were never to keep you out, they were to keep them in. Chapter 4. The Summoning. I left at dawn, my truck loaded with things that might help and probably wouldn't. Salt, silver bullets for my rifle, a cross my mother had given me, tobacco pouches I'd bought from the reservation, offerings for spirits I didn't fully understand. The map burned in my pocket like a coal. The marked location lay 40 miles into the wilderness, far beyond any official trail. I drove as far as the old logging roads would take me, then continued on foot. The forest grew denser with each mile, trees so ancient their roots formed walls and archways. The canopy blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight. By noon, my compass was spinning freely. My GPS showed impossible coordinates that changed each time I looked. But I didn't need technology. The forest was guiding me now. Paths opening where none had existed moments before. I smelled it before I saw it. Wood smoke and something else. Something that made my primitive brain scream warnings. Through the trees, a clearing appeared. In its center stood a structure that shouldn't exist. A perfect circle of standing stones, each twice my height, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in peripheral vision, and they were waiting for me. Tom Henderson stood at the circle's edge, still wearing his ranger uniform, but his body moved wrong, joints bending in too many places, skin rippling as if something beneath was trying to escape. Beside him were others, people I recognized from missing persons reports spanning decades. They watched me with eyes that reflected the darkness between stars. "Mackenzie," Tom said, his voice layered with harmonics no human throat could produce. "Welcome. We've been patient, but patience has limits. What do you want?" My hand rested on my rifle, though I knew it was useless here. "Want?" Tom laughed, a sound like wind through a cave. "We want what was promised, what your kind agreed to, then forgot. The covenant." He gestured to the stone circle. Now I could see what lay at its center. A pit, perfectly round, so deep that light couldn't find its bottom. Around its edge were scratched thousands of names. I recognized some from recent reports. Others were so old the stone had nearly reclaimed them. "Every generation the forest chooses shepherds," Tom continued. "Those who understand the balance, who know that humanity is not separate from nature but part of it. Part of the food chain, part of the cycle." "You're talking about human sacrifice, such a crude term." A woman emerged from the shadows, the singer from Manitoulin Cabin. In daylight, her beauty was terrible, features shifting between human and something older. "We talk about transformation, evolution, becoming what you were meant to be." She moved closer, and I saw the truth. Her dress wasn't fabric but woven from something organic, hair, perhaps, or very fine fur. Her skin had a subtle pattern like tree bark or snake scales. When she smiled, I glimpsed too many teeth. "Your ancestors understood," she said. "They gave us their criminals, their dying, their volunteers. In exchange, we kept to our territories. Let you build your cities, your roads, your small little worlds. But the offering stopped. The covenant broke, so we've been taking what we need. The hikers, the families, barely enough to sustain us. We've been starving, Ranger Mackenzie. Fading. Some have already returned to the earth, unable to maintain form without feeding. Her expression hardened. But no more. The old agreement is void. Unless what? Tom stepped forward. Unless a new covenant is made. A new shepherd chosen. Someone who understands both worlds, who can maintain the balance. I understood then why they'd let me see so much. Why I'd been allowed to interfere for so long. They weren't just hunting. They were recruiting. You want me to... what? Choose who gets taken, choose who gets transformed, the woman corrected. Not all who enter our realm become prey. Some become predators. Some become something greater. Bridges between worlds. She gestured to the others. Now that I looked closer, I could see the variations. Some, like Tom, still resembled their human selves, but wrong. Others had progressed further, bodies shaped by will and hunger into forms that defied classification. And a few had become something beautiful and terrible, beings of bark and shadow and starlight. This is insane. Is it? Tom asked. You've spent years protecting people from the forest, but tell me, Mackenzie, have you ever wondered why you were so good at it? Why you could sense which trails were dangerous? Why the forest showed you its secrets? My mouth went dry. Because he was right. I'd always known things I shouldn't. Always felt the forest's moods, its hunger, its ancient patience. You're already partially transformed, the woman said gently. Have been since childhood. The forest marked you early, prepared you for this role. Fighting it has only made the hunger worse, as if her words were a key. I suddenly felt it, a gnawing emptiness I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it wasn't normal. A need to run on 4 legs, to hunt beneath the moon, to shed this constraining skin and become what I truly was. No. I stepped back, hand tightening on my rifle. Then the taking continues, Tom said sadly. More hikers vanishing, more families destroyed, more children found wandering the woods with stories no one believes. The forest will feed, Mackenzie. The only question is whether it feeds with purpose or without. There has to be another way. The woman laughed, silver and sharp. Another way? Your kind had centuries to find another way. Instead, you forgot us, denied us, tried to tame us. The forest is not tame. It never was. It never will be. She waved her hand and the air shimmered. Through the distortion I saw visions. The forest as it truly was. A living entity. Vast and hungry, dreaming of the days when humans knew their place in its ecosystem. I saw the skinwalkers not as monsters but as antibodies, maintaining balance in a system poisoned by forgetting. Choose, Tom said. Become the shepherd, guide the transformation, help us feed with wisdom and restraint. Or watch as we take without discrimination, without mercy, until the balance forcibly corrects itself. I looked at the pit, at the names carved in stone. So many lives, so many transformations, and I thought of the hikers who would come tomorrow, next week, next year. Innocent people who just wanted to touch something wild and free, unless someone guided them away. Unless someone who understood both worlds stood between them. If I agree, I said slowly. What happens? You complete your transformation, the woman said. Become what you've always been inside, and in return you help us choose. The old, the sick, the evil, those whose transformation serves the greater balance. The forest feeds, but thoughtfully, carefully, as it did in the old days. And if someone refuses to be chosen, Tom's smile was sad and sharp. Then they're not truly chosen, are they? The forest only takes the willing, Mackenzie. It's humans who forgot that willing doesn't always mean conscious. I thought of Jessica Rodriguez, of Maria Gonzalez, of all the ones who'd been released. Had they been unwilling, or had they served their purpose as messengers, spreading fear and fascination that would draw others in? The sun was setting. Through the trees, I could see the first stars appearing. The stone circle began to glow with a light that came from somewhere else. Decide, the woman said. The moon rises soon, and with it the hunt begins, either with you as shepherd, or without. I looked at my rifle, my badge, my human hands. Then I looked at the forest, ancient and patient and hungry. I thought of all the people I'd saved over the years, all the ones I'd guided away from danger. Had I been protecting them? Or had I been selecting them? The distinction suddenly seemed meaningless. Show me, I whispered. The woman smiled and extended her hand. When I took it, her skin felt like bark warmed by sun. She led me to the pit's edge, and together we looked down into the darkness that was not darkness but possibility. The first lesson, she said, is that transformation is not death, it's birth. Painful, yes. Terrifying, certainly. But on the other side, she let the sentence hang, but I could feel the promise in it. Freedom from human constraints. Unity with something vast and timeless. Purpose beyond the small concerns of civilization. Will I remember? I asked. Who I was? You'll remember everything, Tom answered. That's the burden of shepherds, to know both worlds, belong to both, be fully of neither. But in time the memories become stories, and stories become dreams, and dreams become truth. I stood at the edge of choice, feeling the forest's hunger like my own, knowing that whether I said yes or no, the outcome was the same. The forest would feed. The only question was how. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. The transformation began with the shedding of clothes, not just fabric, but the very concept of covering. My ranger uniform fell away like dead bark, revealing skin that was already changing, patterns emerging like hidden tattoos written in chlorophyll and shadow. The woman, who I now understood had never been human at all, guided me into the pit. But instead of falling, I descended along stairs carved from living root. The walls pulsed with bioluminescence, revealing cave paintings that moved and shifted, telling stories of the first covenant, the first shepherds, the first willing transformations. Pain is the price of becoming, she whispered, her voice now inside my skull. Do not fight it. And there was pain. Bones breaking and reforming, muscles tearing and reweaving, neurons firing in patterns that human biology couldn't support. I screamed, but the sound that emerged was wind through leaves, water over stone, the earth itself groaning. Time became meaningless. I was a seed in dark soil. I was prey fleeing through moonlight. I was the hunter's breath on the back of a neck. I was the forest dreaming of what it had been, what it could become. When I finally emerged from the pit, the world had changed. Or perhaps I was finally seeing it clearly. Colors existed beyond human perception, the ultraviolet signatures of fear, the infrared trails of desire, sounds layered into complex symphonies, the heartbeats of mice beneath the snow, the whispered conversations of trees through mycorrhizal networks, the slow breathing of the mountain itself, and the smells. God, the smells. Every human who'd passed through this clearing in the last century had left their scent story written in molecules, their hopes, their terrors, their final moments, all preserved in an olfactory library that my new senses could read like books. I looked at my hands, still shaped like hands, but wrong. Too many joints, skin that shifted between bark and flesh and something altogether other. When I concentrated, they could become paws, claws, branches, or remain almost human. Almost beautiful, the woman said, and I understood she meant it truly. You've taken to it better than most. The forest chose well. Tom approached, moving with the fluid grace of something that had abandoned the pretense of humanity. The hunger will be strongest at first. We'll teach you to manage it, to choose wisely. As if summoned by his words, I felt it, a gnawing need that made my previous human hungers seem like gentle suggestions. I could smell them now, the humans scattered throughout the forest, hikers bedding down for the night, rangers at their stations, the town beyond the park boundaries, full of warm bodies and racing hearts. Easy, the woman crooned, touching my face with fingers like twigs. Focus, remember your purpose. You're not a mindless predator. You're a shepherd. What do I do? My voice was layered now, harmonics that human ears would find disturbing. First, you return to your station, Tom said. Complete your reports. File paperwork that explains your extended absence. Maintain your cover. Cover? I laughed, the sound like wind chimes made of bone. How can I go back looking like this? Look again, the woman suggested. I glanced down and gasped. My body looked human again. Ranger uniform intact, skin the right color and texture, hands with the proper number of joints. But I could feel the lie of it, the effort required to maintain this shape. The first gift of the covenant, she explained. To walk between worlds, you must appear to belong to both. In time, holding human form will become as natural as breathing. But remember, it's a costume, nothing more. They taught me through the night how to recognize the forest's true children from ordinary animals, how to read the signs that marked someone as chosen for transformation, how to project subtle wrongness that would make smart humans turn back without knowing why, and most importantly, how to feed without killing, how to take just enough essence to sustain myself while leaving the donor alive. Confused, but ultimately unharmed. The old shepherds were too gentle, Tom explained as we practiced on a sleeping deer. They took only from the willing, only from those already dying. The forest grew weak, desperate. We can't make that mistake again. By dawn, I understood my role. I would return to my position, continue my work as a ranger. But now I would serve a dual purpose. Protecting some humans from the forest, yes, but also selecting others for it. The sick, the evil, the lost, those whose transformation would serve the greater balance. How will I know? I asked as we stood at the forest's edge, my human shape settling over me like an uncomfortable coat. You'll know, the woman assured me. The forest will tell you, and in time, you'll develop your own criteria. Each shepherd interprets the covenant differently. And if I refuse? If I try to warn everyone, keep them all away? Tom's expression was almost pitying. Then the others will feed without discrimination. And you'll grow hungry enough that instinct overrides conscience. We've seen it before, Mackenzie. The shepherds who try to starve themselves, to deny their nature. They become the worst predators of all. I nodded, understanding. There was no going back. Only forward, into this strange new existence between worlds. The walk back to my truck was surreal. My human eyes saw the familiar forest, but underneath I perceived so much more. The trees were aware, their roots connected in vast networks of communication. The stones held memories of geological ages, and everywhere, invisible to normal sight, were the others, skinwalkers in various forms, watching, waiting, patient as the mountains. At the station I filed my reports. Got lost following up on the Loxahatchee incident, GPS malfunction. Spent 2 days hiking in circles before finding my way back. Brennan bought it, even expressed concern for my well-being. Maybe you should take more time off, he suggested. No, I said, perhaps too quickly. I'm good. Better than I've been in years, actually. And it was true. The constant anxiety I'd carried was gone, replaced by purpose. The forest no longer frightened me. I was part of it now, protector and predator both. That first week was the hardest, learning to manage the hunger while maintaining my human facade. But I discovered I could feed in small ways, a touch that drained a hiker's energy, leaving them tired enough to turn back. A whispered suggestion that made campers pack up and leave. Each feeding was minor, but cumulative. They sustained me, and I watched, evaluated, judged. The businessman who dumped chemical waste near the creek. He disappeared on a solo hike, body never found. The group of college kids who tortured a captured fox. They ran screaming from the woods, claiming the trees had come alive. Most never returned to the forest. But one did, drawn by something he couldn't name. He vanished properly the second time. I learned to recognize the forest's choices. Some people carried a mark visible only to transformed eyes, a darkness that called for cleansing, or a light that begged for evolution. These I guided, subtly, toward the deep places where the others waited, but most I protected, as I always had. Families with children, young couples in love, the lonely souls who came seeking solace in nature's embrace. These I kept safe, steering them away from ancient groves and hungry shadows. The forest fed, but thoughtfully, carefully, as it had in the old days when humans still remembered their place in the cycle. Months passed. My human mask became easier to wear, though never comfortable. I attended ranger meetings, filed reports, even dated a school teacher from town, though I made sure she never came too deep into the woods. But at night, when the moon was dark and the forest sang its oldest songs, I shed my human shape and ran with the others. We hunted memories and dreams, fed on fear and wonder, maintained the balance between worlds, and sometimes, in the deepest part of night, we gathered at the stone circle. The woman would tell stories of the time before forgetting, when every village had its shepherd, every forest its covenant. Tom would speak of the future, when the barriers would finally dissolve, and humanity would remember its true nature. It's already beginning, he said one night, gesturing to the lights of distant cities. They feel the emptiness of their separation. They come to the woods seeking something they can't name. Some find peace, others find transformation, all find truth. I thought of the hikers I'd guided away, the ones I'd guided toward, the balance I maintained with each choice. Are we saving them or damning them? I asked. The woman smiled with too many teeth. Is there a difference? Every ending is a beginning, every death is a birth. The forest doesn't judge, it only transforms. A year into my new existence, Maria Gonzalez contacted me. She'd recovered, mostly, though she still woke screaming from dreams of drowned singers. She wanted to understand what had happened to her friends. I met her at a coffee shop in town, maintaining my human appearance carefully. I've been researching, she said, sliding a folder across the table. Old stories, indigenous legends, disappearance patterns. There's something in those woods, isn't there? Something that takes people. I could have lied. Should have, probably. But looking at her haunted eyes, I chose a different path. Yes, I said simply. She stared at me, not expecting honesty. What is it? Something old. Something hungry. Something that used to have a place in the world but got pushed to the margins. I leaned forward. Your friends, they became part of it. Not dead, not alive, transformed. Into what? Into what we all were before we forgot how to change. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, could I see them? Talk to them? The request surprised me. Most survivors wanted only to forget, but Maria had the mark on her. Not of prey or predator, but of something else. A potential bridge. Why would you want that? Because I dream of them. Every night. They're calling me back. She met my eyes. And part of me wants to go. I studied her, seeing deeper than human sight allowed. The forest had touched her, left its fingerprint on her soul. She could never fully return to normal life. But she might not need full transformation either. There's another way, I said carefully. A middle path. Dangerous, but Possible. That night, I brought Maria to the stone circle. The others were skeptical. She wasn't chosen for transformation or feeding. But the woman saw what I saw. A speaker, she said with interest. How long since we had one of those? Maria became our voice to the human world. Not transformed, but changed enough to understand. She wrote articles about forest safety that carried subtle warnings, created art that captured the beautiful terror of the wild places, spoke at universities about respecting boundaries, both geographical and metaphysical, and occasionally, when someone came to her with dreams of the forest, with the mark glowing clear in their eyes, she would send them to me. The covenant evolved, no longer just predator and prey, but a complex ecology of human and other, civilized and wild, static and transformed. The forest still fed, but with purpose. The barriers still held, but with doorways for those meant to cross. I write this from my station 5 years after my transformation. Dawn is breaking over the mountains, painting the forest in shades of gold and shadow. Soon hikers will arrive, seeking adventure or peace or something they can't name. I'll greet them with a ranger's smile, check their permits, offer advice about trails. Most will have a wonderful day and return home with photos and memories, but a few will carry the mark. And for them, I'll suggest a different path, a deeper trail, a place where the old stories still walk. The forest is patient. It has waited this long. It can wait longer. But the hunger remains, the need for balance, for remembrance, for transformation. And I remain its shepherd, walking between worlds, maintaining the covenant written in bark and blood and starlight. Neither fully human nor completely other, but something more useful. A bridge across the forgetting, a guide through the dark woods of becoming. The radio crackles with the morning's first call. Another hiker, probably lost. I reach for the receiver, already knowing what I'll find, already choosing which path to suggest. The forest whispers its approval, and I smile with too many teeth. The cycle continues.